everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
DanMachi, Why Am I Being Crowned the Lord of Cinder? Chapter 197 to 216. Chapter 197. After a long day of chip damage, the scraping master decides on one final dance. For a tanky, high HP fire giant like this, the best approach was simple: stack bleed status effects as hard as possible, kite with mobility, and even if it was just chip damage, grind it down slowly. That was Ron's plan. With the margin for error provided by his revival skill, even if he got caught slipping, he still had 2 chances left. He looked at the 2 short swords in his hands, now fully enchanted. The eerie, blood-red glow oozed with a sinister aura, just like the Bloodlord's power itself. Relying on the healing gourd from the Sekiro template, Ron could visibly feel his injuries recovering. But the pain in his abdomen didn't fade nearly as fast. Staring at the monster in the distance, he clenched his teeth and spat out each word. Of course I'm gonna blow him the hell up. After personally witnessing Ron's smooth-as-silk self-disembowelment move and those disturbingly sinister enchanted blades, Tiona couldn't help but swallow hard. She really wanted to ask, who the hell was actually from the country of blood and fighting here? At this point, it was obvious. Ron wasn't cutting himself for fun. He clearly had some kind of twisted ability that could temporarily boost his weapon's offensive power. But understanding not equal to accepting. What kind of sane person fights like this? Tiona couldn't make sense of it, but she was thoroughly shaken. Facing Ron's gaze, so different from his usual self, now savage and feral, the girl instinctively looked away. She really was afraid of people who didn't care about their own lives. Even in the arenas of the country of blood and fighting, she had never seen someone this insane. Although her own skill set was completely different from his. Berserk. Intense heat. These were skills that boosted attack power when injured, or massively enhanced all stats when on the brink of death. Despite having mastered these skills for a long time, Tiona had never once activated them on purpose. But now, looking at Ron's ruthless eyes, she lowered her gaze to the massive twin blades in her hands. Maybe this was just another kind of rabid, all-out biting combat style? Captain Finn's panacea, capable of healing most fatal injuries, was partially in her possession. Looking at the boy again, Tiona felt a strange urge to try. Should I cut myself too? What, you wanna throw yourself into the Bloodlord's embrace as well? The weapon enchantment wasn't permanent. Once the blood absorbed by the blades completely dried up, they would lose the bleed status effect. He had to end this fast. As Ron felt his body steadily recovering, now back to a level where he could fight properly, he looked forward. The fire giant was already closing in, that massive pot-lid weapon clutched in its hands. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. No need for words. Relying on his extreme speed, his full attention locked onto the weapon in the fire giant's hands. He didn't charge in recklessly like a moth to a flame. Instead, he circled around the perimeter, flanking. A body that massive came with a clear drawback: low mobility. No matter what, he'd just be hacking at its feet. So he might as well pick a better angle. At the same time, harassing the fire giant from behind would also buy time for Lefia to cast her magic, setting up a pincer attack from both front and rear. Lefia, it's up to you now. Watching Ron move in to harass the enemy, Tiona knew she couldn't just stand by any longer. In the end, she still chose not to imitate Ron's method. This is insane. In the short term, it could indeed unleash much greater power, but there was still no way to quickly take down this fire giant, and his body had already suffered heavy damage. Maybe, in this battle, he might even end up becoming a burden to the team. No problem. To be thrown into a situation like this right after starting a dungeon expedition, but compared to that Ash Judge, Lefia would much rather fight the fire giant in front of her. At least the visual impact wasn't nearly as overwhelming. In this kind of situation, wide-area attack magic wouldn't be very effective. She had to concentrate power into a single point to break through the floor boss's defenses, and among her spells, Arc's Ray was absolutely the best choice in terms of effect. Not far ahead, the fire giant had already halted its steps. Its full attention had been drawn to Ron, who was harassing it from behind. That gave Lefia plenty of time to chant. As her magic power was guided forth, a pure white radiance, symbolizing absolute purity, began to gather around the elven girl, eventually shaping itself into a magnificent, pristine arrow. With the support of fairy cannon, the already absurdly powerful magic was amplified even further, its effect doubled. Penetrate, arrow of absolute accuracy, Alio. As the chant concluded, the arrow formed entirely from magic shone so brightly that it completely drowned out the flames lining the cavern walls as it shot forward in an instant. Like a brilliant meteor, it carved a trail of starlight through the air. Boom! With its homing effect, there was no need to worry about hitting allies, and the target it locked onto was the fire giant's chest. Straight at the heart. The already massive pool of magic power, boosted by the skill's amplification, allowed Ark's ray to unleash firepower on par with a level 5 adventurer. At Yuan, the explosive force was enough to break through the fire giant's defenses, blasting open a bloody wound, accompanied by the floor boss's deafening roar echoing through the boss room along with the effect of forced stop. It worked. But Lefia's body couldn't make any further movements. Her thoughts went blank, and a violent ringing echoed in her ears. Forced stop. Just as the name implied. Even at a distance, its effect was overwhelming. As for the one directly facing the shockwave, Master Ron, who had devoted himself to the art of ankle-scraping chip damage, wasn't affected too heavily. His movements remained sharp. However, fresh blood was visibly dripping from his ears, and the nauseating sensation of his internal organs churning couldn't be ignored. The fire giant's roar could no longer be measured in mere decibels, he only felt his eardrums screaming in pain, fighting purely on instinct. A barrage of sword strikes, as dense and relentless as a storm, continued to carve wound after wound into the floor boss. Relying on the bleed status effect, even with the fire giant's powerful regeneration, the cuts from the short swords still caused thick, dark red blood to flow continuously. But, for the floor boss, the damage was nothing more than a drop in the ocean. How long the hell am I supposed to keep scraping like this? No one could give him an answer. After working himself to the bone for so long, Ron felt his condition steadily worsening under the direct impact. From behind his back, he pulled out the newly acquired spiral greatsword. Godslayer's greatsword. At this point, there was only one option left. The final dance. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 198, Chapter 198, Queen's Black Flame, this is my final pulse. 1,348 words. Queen's Black Flame. A great sword capable of hunting even gods, there was no way it would be useless against a fire giant. Squeezing out the very last bit of life from his already ruined body, he turned it into black flame, and burned the floor boss before him to ashes. Tiona. If I collapse later, remember to move my body somewhere cool. Compared to goblin guards and landsoaks, if the thing in front of him actually had an HP bar, it would probably be even longer than Ron's own life. They hadn't even scraped out the fire giant's second phase yet. And besides, if he faced that forced stop roar at close range again, Ron had a feeling his internal organs would be completely shattered. At this point, he couldn't maintain focus anyway. So he might as well burn everything to the end. He could feel a tingling numbness spread across his entire body. Raising his hand, he wiped the warm blood off his cheek. Relying on the bleed status, even if he fought by trading his life for damage, even if he burned through both of his revival chances, he still might not be able to kill it outright. Holding her twin great blades, already launching a fierce offensive against the fire giant. When Tiona heard Ron's reminder, her backward step widened noticeably. She pulled back to a safe distance. The tan-skinned Amazoness stared ahead. At Ron's miserable state, with blood slowly seeping from the corners of his eyes, nose, and ears. Her heartbeat nearly stopped. Near-death recovery. To be honest, she had seen this unique magic with her own eyes. It was Ron's final trump card. A symbol that the concept of death had already been stripped away from him. But saying something like "move my corpse," anyone who heard that would feel something hard to describe. Before Tiona could even ask, her gaze caught Ron again. His steps were still steady and agile, as he raised the spiral greatsword taken from the Ash Judge. the black flames blazing upon it, more brilliant than ever before. That aura of extinction seemed to point directly at the very origin of existence itself. Tiona had never seen such a bizarre weapon. Or perhaps magic. And the price was clear. Ron, still in his youth, now had streaks of white appearing at his temples, as if his life force was being forcibly drained by the magic. What the hell are you trying to do? Wasn't the plan. If they couldn't win, they'd retreat from the floor boss room, wait for Tion's support, and if that still didn't work, wait for the Loki familiar to handle it. So why? Why was he suddenly going full self-destruct again? Tiona felt like her head was about to explode. But even at such a critical moment, she didn't retreat. Instead, she chose to trust Ron's decision. Someone with a future broader than any adventurer, there was no way he would joke around with his own life, right? And just as Tiona guessed, Ron was actually terrified of death. He hadn't lost that fear just because of his revival ability. But if this life couldn't be preserved no matter what, then why not squeeze out a bit more AoE damage before dying? As if responding to Ron's resolve, the Godslayer's greatsword began draining his life force even faster. In exchange, the Queen's black flame grew even more violently intense. It had no temperature. And yet, from those black flames, as if born from the deepest abyss of hell, one could still feel the overwhelming offensive power contained within. Damn it. After killing this fire giant, you better drop me some damn good loot. Feeling his life force rapidly slipping away, Ron charged toward the fire giant once more. Each swing of the spiral blade released arcs of black flame. When they struck the floor boss's massive body, they left behind flames that would never extinguish no matter what. Ignoring defense. In an extremely short span of time, that rootless black flame burned straight through the fire giant's thick outer layer, and the air filled with the stench of charred flesh. The giant's language was incomprehensible. But the damage caused by the Queen's black flame, the fire giant could feel it directly. And it hurt far more than that elf's magic. Unlike before, it no longer treated Ron, who had been merely scratching its hardened skin under its feet, as something negligible. It even had a premonition: if it let this black flame continue burning, it would die. So, the fire giant raised its foot high, trying to crush him like an ant. I know your feet are pretty damn impressive. But do you really have to go this far? If it were some foot fetish freak, even those cracked, calloused, dead skin-covered feet of the fire giant would probably look beautiful to him. But clearly, Ron wasn't that kind of person. If it were Hestia stepping on his back, sure, he could accept a soft, cute girl. But there was no way he was messed up enough to calmly accept getting stomped on by a floor boss like this. And as his life force continued to drain, the most immediate effect was the decline of his bodily functions. If, before activating the Godslayer's greatsword's rampage state, Ron was merely in a condition where his internal organs were injured, then now, as his life kept slipping away, he was like a dying old man on his last leg. Damn it. Relying on the combat instincts honed through dungeon experience, he forcibly dragged his body into a roll toward the front side, barely dodging the fire giant's stomp. And the price was a body that felt like it was about to fall apart. Maybe you should just kill me already. Ron really wanted to give up. But he still forced himself back to his feet, once again swinging the Godslayer's greatsword in his hand. This time, he didn't continue attacking the areas already engulfed by black flame. Instead, he slashed at parts of the fire giant's body that hadn't been affected yet. With every swing, the black flame carried by the blade seemed to take root the moment it landed, clinging like a parasite that could not be removed, spreading at a visible speed, gradually engulfing both legs. As for the parts he couldn't reach, he raised his arm using the grappling hook of his shinobi prosthetic. He anchored it directly into the fire giant's body. Using the retraction force, he launched himself from the ground, chasing the floor boss while spreading black flame. Passing on the fire. Passing on black flame, wasn't that still fire? Until, that black flame, capable of burning even gods to nothing, leaving no chance of revival, visibly spread across nearly 30% of the fire giant's body. Ron's consciousness was already close to fading. With difficulty, he turned his head, looking toward Tiona in the distance. After receiving Ron's earlier instruction, Tiona had already stopped attacking the fire giant, worried that in full combat, she wouldn't be able to spare attention to support him. Of course. A large part of the reason was also how terrifying that black flame was. If she got touched by it, she didn't even dare imagine what would happen. But from the perspective of a bystander, she could see even more clearly Ron's rapidly deteriorating condition. His once striking black hair was now nothing but dry, pale white. Even his skin had become like that of an old man, lined with deep wrinkles, as if he had completely burned himself out. It was hard to believe that he was the same age as Lefia, especially when she saw that figure, now without grappling support, falling freely toward the ground. She didn't hesitate at all. Tiona moved decisively, catching Ron mid-air in her arms. Facing the boy's gradually unfocused eyes, her gaze turned complicated. "Is there anything else you want to say?" "Yeah." Looking at the black flames, now covering nearly half of the fire giant's body, burning fiercely, Ron was actually quite satisfied with his handiwork. Just before his consciousness completely faded, he spoke with a tone full of emotion. "Tiona, this is my final ripple. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 199, Chapter 199, Fire Giant Phase 2, Just Go All Out. 1,227 words. They arrived at the dungeon's 17th floor. An extremely eerie atmosphere hung over the entire expedition party, especially with the furious roars echoing endlessly through the tunnels. It made one thing unmistakably clear: the battle ahead had already begun. Up ahead, staring at the extremely complex cave passages, Mikoto, serving as their guide, was naturally under the most pressure. She hadn't been part of the Hestia familiar for long, and her sensing ability at this depth wasn't particularly reliable. If she chose the wrong path, even a tiny deviation could lead to a completely different destination. Which way do we go next? No one could give her an answer. Mikoto could only force herself to stay calm, trying to trace Ron's location through her senses. But at that moment, as if something had lost its life, that faint connection suddenly vanished completely. She stood frozen in place. Even her dark eyes turned blank. The disappearance of that connection meant only one thing: Ron, facing the floor boss, had already died. However, she had seen this happen many times before. There was no time to waste dwelling on it. With Tiona and Lefia from the Loki familiar present, they should be able to hold out long enough for Ron to revive. "Captain Ron, something's happened." Without hesitating over which tunnel to choose, Mikoto decided to trust her instincts. After briefly explaining to the others, she immediately rushed forward at full speed along the path ahead. This wasn't a joke. Even from a great distance, the floor boss's roars could still be heard clearly. No ordinary floor boss could produce such terrifying noise. Thinking about how her younger sister might be in danger right now, Tyon didn't ask a single question. Her focus sharpened to its peak as she sprinted forward, eyes locked straight ahead while the dim cave walls blurred past. Until, up ahead, the vast, open chamber of the floor boss. With the firelight burning along the walls, Tyon finally saw it clearly. In the distance stood a fire giant, its entire body engulfed in black flames. Its size was enormous. However, wrapped in that strange black fire, this unprecedented floor boss wasn't continuing its assault. From the devastated surroundings, it was easy to tell how intense the battle had been. There wasn't a single intact patch of ground left, only piles of rubble everywhere. Then, when she saw her sister Tiona unharmed in the distance, she finally let out a breath of relief. Lefia, acting as ranged support, was also safe. That was one of the few pieces of good news. It's just, where's Ron? When dealing with a floor boss, gathering information was crucial. She didn't rush into combat. Instead, she chose to regroup with Tiona and Lefia first. And then, she saw it. A figure lying in her sister's arms, like a dying candle flickering in the wind. His life force had been drained to the extreme, his hair completely white, his skin wrinkled. It looked familiar. Judging from the facial features, she could barely recognize him as Ron. What the hell? Tyon stood there with her mouth open, her emotions tangled beyond words. Especially when she saw Lefia completely unharmed, and her own sister safe and sound. She almost wanted to ask, just what exactly had you been protecting? What happened? Give me the key points. We're trapped on the 17th floor. This fire giant is a mutated floor boss. The flames covering its body were inflicted by Ron's magic. The floor boss's raw stats, even among level 5s, would be considered top tier. Seeing the serious expression on her sister's face, Tiona could easily imagine how bad her mood was right now. But she didn't dwell on it, and instead laid out all the information they currently had. Then that part, at least, made sense. Even for level 5 adventurers, quickly killing a level 4 floor boss was already difficult, let alone a mutated, completely unknown monster. It's just. Looking at Ron in his current, barely recognizable state, Tion's emotions were a tangled mess. In a situation like this, could a panacea really heal his injuries? Especially with the members of the Hestia familia watching. She had no idea what she was supposed to say. You don't need to worry about Captain Ron's safety. In the end, the one who broke the silence was Mikoto, the person present who understood Ron the best. His condition did look miserable, but compared to when he faced the ancient dragon Landsoaks, well, at least his body was still intact. She quickly withdrew her gaze and looked toward the fire giant in the distance. Its sheer size alone was oppressive, not to mention its overwhelming strength. What we need to think about next is how we're going to defeat this floor boss. The moment Mikoto finished speaking, under the continuous burning of the Queen's black flame, the fire giant, its body already torn open and charred black over more than half its mass, still didn't collapse. Nor did the floor boss continue trying to extinguish the black flames. Instead, it knelt on one knee. Its massive crimson eyes were filled with murderous fury. The giant mouth on its abdomen, which had previously closed, was now opening at a visible rate. Then, the fire giant reached into its abdomen and pulled out flames. Compared to the black flames burning its body, this fire was clearly far more normal. At Hashuan, roaring furiously, it smeared the flames it had extracted from its abdomen across its body, attempting to use the evil god's fire to overwrite the Queen's black flame. The effect was immediate. As the purest form of flame, it visibly began to suppress and cover the black fire until it completely disappeared. And the legs that had previously been burned by the black flames. The fire giant directly smashed them apart. Within the blaze of that evil god fire, it offered them up as sacrifices. At this moment, its towering body raised the flaming remains high with both hands, arching backward in a bizarre posture. On its chest, that massive single eye slowly began to open. All it was missing was some intense background music to announce the arrival of the fire giant's new phase. The scene was simply too horrifying. It had smashed off its own legs as offerings, sacrificing them in exchange for greater power. That massive eye looked as though flames were flowing within it. And more than that, they could clearly feel the floor boss's presence growing stronger. From the gaping mouth in the fire giant's abdomen, pure flames continuously surged upward from the ground, as if it intended to turn the entire area into a sea of fire. What the hell kind of monster is this? This all too familiar scene was gradually overlapping with Cassandra's prophetic dream. In that sea of fire, every member of the expedition party had been unable to escape, completely swallowed. Her body trembled instinctively, and at that moment, feeling the sudden weight of a firm hand landing on her shoulder, along with the warmth spreading through it, Cassandra shivered. She turned her head and saw the black-haired boy, completely unharmed, stretching his body as he stood beside her. And those eyes, the ones that reassured her. Ron glanced around at everyone. Yeah. Now that everyone's here, what's there to talk about? Let's just go all out. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 200, Chapter 200, Phase 2, Gravity Locks the Giant. 1,348 words. Dying of old age. This was, without a doubt, the gentlest death Ron had experienced since arriving in the world of DanMachi. There wasn't much pain, all of his senses had been completely numbed. He simply reached the natural end of his life. How much time had passed? Ron couldn't remember anymore. That was what a life flashing before one's eyes felt like, until the powerful beating within his chest gradually awakened his dormant consciousness. Revival. He moved his body slightly, testing his limbs. There was nothing more reassuring than realizing something was wrong and having his expedition teammates rush over at full speed to the Floor 17 area to provide support. It was just. Looking at the fire giant in the distance, now having entered an entirely new phase, Ron couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. He had already consumed a use of revival just to get things to this point. However, the good news was that everyone had fully regrouped. 2 LV.5 adventurers, Lefia, whose firepower could reach the same level, and Mikoto, who possessed bug-level gravity magic. The fire giant might be powerful, but it wasn't necessarily unbeatable. Noticing that Ron had fully recovered, Cassandra felt relieved. But when she looked at the fire giant in its peak state, she couldn't quite feel happy about it. She lifted her head, tucking the blue strands of hair that covered her cheek behind her ear. "Captain Ron, you're okay. Those who turned to look at him weren't just her, but also the Hiryute sisters and Lefia, whose attention had been drawn to the floor boss's new phase. In such a short span of time, Ron, who had been at death's door, practically a dying old man, now stood before them completely fine, as if nothing had happened. Even though they had already witnessed miracles before, seeing it happen again right in front of them. The complexity in their eyes betrayed their emotions. Near-death recovery. Even a natural death caused by exhausting one's life force would still trigger it. The implications behind this were far more shocking than when they had encountered the ancient dragon Landsoaks. Looking at it from another angle, perhaps the very concept of death had completely lost its meaning for Ron, but compared to prying into that secret, dealing with the immediate danger was clearly more important, especially with the floor boss fire giant having fully gone berserk after completing its sacrifice. "Ron, what do we do next?" "Fight. This thing is really strong. We absolutely can't hold back. If we want to complete this familiar expedition, we have to find a way to kill the fire giant." Right now, Ron could only feel that the cheat abilities he had weren't enough. He didn't have a skill like Belle's that could turn the tide in desperate situations. Continuing to rely on conventional combat methods. Those methods might not work well against the fire giant. Not only that, in a battle of this level, Daphne and Elfie wouldn't be able to contribute much. If they joined recklessly, they might even get caught in the crossfire. As for Cassandra, being able to give early warnings through her prophetic dreams was already her greatest contribution. Besides, the original purpose of this familiar expedition was for them to face Souls-like type ordinary monsters and achieve overall improvement in their status. But a boss fight, and against a fire giant whose strength rivaled top-tier LV.5 adventurers? Seriously? I'll put up a defensive spell for you. As a member of the Familiar, Daphne naturally understood this. In a situation like this, her strength clearly didn't match the level of the main combatants, so she focused on providing support. Rauma. A laurel armor. It could enhance endurance and greatly increase the target's agility. This was the most effective support she could think of for this boss fight. All right. Make sure you watch your own safety. Ron had no objections. In the end, he shifted his gaze toward the 2 Amazonas girls beside him, their expressions solemn. Their presence would determine the final outcome of this boss fight. "Sorry to trouble you, seniors." "Don't say that." As expected, no such thing as an easy job. What he thought would just be a routine familiar expedition had now reached the point where even she had to go all out. Tyon waved her hand dismissively. "This is still just the middle floors, damn it. If they really teamed up with Ron and went down to the lower floors or even the deep floors, she didn't dare imagine just how strong the monsters and floor bosses would be." Looking at the fire giant, supporting itself on both arms as it advanced step by step, she let out a helpless sigh. This might be a bit tough, but we can give it a try. And at that moment, Mikoto, who had already finished her battle preparations, wasn't holding the katana at her waist. As the fire giant drew closer, the girl's gaze turned resolute. She murmured softly, "I respectfully speak to you, my war god that can break through anything, lead me from the precious heaven. Give my petty body divine power of your grand body. Rescue them light of purification, sword of crushing evil. Sweep sword of suppression, sacred sword of conquest. It arrives here now by my order. Descend from heaven, rule the earth. As her magic surged, her body was locked in place, unable to move. Even beads of sweat formed on her forehead. Then, a gravity field constructed from magic formed directly beneath the towering fire giant in the distance, manifesting as a magic circle. Along with it, a massive purple greatsword formed of magic lightly pressed against the ground. Only then did she finish her chant, Shinbu Tusei. Boom. An overspec gravity spell. Using the point where the purple greatsword touched the ground as its center, began spreading outward, continuously applying crushing force. The ground, already battered from the battle, now cracked further, fractures spreading like a spiderweb. Even the fire giant's body was forcibly pinned down. Its advance came to a complete halt, its mobility drastically restricted. From here on, I'll leave the fight to you. The Futsuno Mitama she wielded after her level up was being used on a floor boss for the first time. As for how long it could last, probably a few minutes. Gravity magic. Since when did the Hestia Familiar have someone like this? However, there was no time for Tyon and Tiona to dwell on it. From the Far East girl's tense expression alone, they could tell the spell's consumption was enormous. She was buying them an opportunity to attack. After the brief separation in the dungeon, the two inseparable Amazonas sisters regrouped once more. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Fighting alone was never their strength. What mattered was the battle coordination they had built through constant companionship. In this boss fight, they had no hesitation whatsoever, kind of looking forward to it. After taking down this floor boss fire giant, we should be able to level up to LV.6 through this great feat, right? Why is someone raising a flag right now? Ron really wanted to complain. Looking at the blasphemous flames of an evil god spreading across the fire giant's body, he lightly rubbed his cheek, suddenly thinking of a way to rapidly increase his own strength. Power within. Absorb the flames, temporarily increase strength and endurance. The boost depended on the power of the flames themselves. Those flames, judged as belonging to an evil god by the Golden Order, the enhancement should be quite significant, right? Why does it feel like I'm either about to self-destruct, or already on my way to it? Meanwhile, sensing the violent disturbance on floor 17 caused by the abnormal situation, the members of Evolus, who were searching for Ron under Filvis's instructions, quickly advanced along the cavern passage leading straight to the boss room. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. Patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 201, Chapter 201, A Sea of 1,264 words. Relying on Futsuno Mitama's gravity magic to restrain it, the fire giant, whose limbs were already damaged, had its movements restricted even further. But that did not mean the floor boss before them had lost the ability to fight back. We still have to be careful. Ron did not rush forward recklessly. Since he had chosen to keep self-destructing, using the Ashen One's safe state ability to squeeze out his body's power within, then of course he needed to find the right opportunity. And up ahead, in the distance, he watched those two figures, the Amazonas girls moving swiftly across the battlefield, their speed not dropping in the slightest despite the presence of the gravity field. Tyon and Tiona's strength was beyond question. At around the same age, they had become level 5 adventurers through their own talent alone, without cheating. There was no need to say anything more about their gifts. It was just that, their combat style, compared with the technique represented by the war god Takamikazuchi, was more like something honed through endless life-and-death battles. Their movements had no wasted motion, nor could they be described as flashy. Their goal was extremely clear: to deal the highest possible damage as quickly as possible. I can't just keep watching either. After revival was successfully activated, Ron's combat condition returned to its peak once more. Not only his stamina, but even his reserves of magic power had been fully restored. Looking at the fire giant as it entered its new phase, At that massive single eye embedded in the fire giant's chest, its pupil pattern looked like flowing magma, as though filled with the wickedness of an evil god. He tightened his grip around the gravel stone seal in his palm. No chant was needed. A crest formed from magic power, symbolizing ancient dragon faith, appeared in Ron's palm, as leaping red lightning continued to gather. Finally, under his guidance, it transformed into a long spear forged from crimson fire lightning. Whoosh! Red lightning pierced the air, exploding with a brilliance like rising fireworks. With Ron's full-force throw, that ancient dragon lightning spear shot toward the huge single eye on the fire giant's chest and struck it with pinpoint accuracy. Even though it had reacted in advance, and the floor boss had already prepared a countermeasure, the slowly closing eye still could not keep up with the speed of that ancient dragon lightning spear. Boom! The instant it made contact, a violent explosion erupted. The fire giant, whose body was already extremely bloated and weighed down by an even stronger gravity spell, nearly lost its balance. Its flesh was blasted apart by the lightning spear. Dark red, viscous blood began to pour out. The ancient dragon incantation's assault made the floor boss roar in pain once again, but in this situation, it could not make any effective counterattack. Good chance. It was not Lefia's Arc's Ray. This was probably one of Ron's hidden cards that he had not shown before, but at a time like this, Tiona had no spare time to think. All she knew was that this was their chance to attack. As she closed in on the fire giant, the evil god's flames dripping from the twin mouths in the floor boss's abdominal cavity continued to give off scorching heat where they fell to the ground. However, thanks to the magical support from Daphne, an adventurer of the Hestia Familiar, the defensive shield formed around her body, glowing like the radiance of a laurel tree, greatly eased the discomfort it caused her. Attack the fire giant's torso directly? That was obviously unrealistic. She focused all her attention on the floor boss's two hands braced against the ground. In this situation, of course she had to attack the enemy's weakness. She didn't use magic. First of all, Tiona simply couldn't. The girl's combat style was simple and direct. Her expression turned solemn as she gripped her massive twin blades tightly and decisively swung them with full force at the fire giant's arm. P.S. As a first-class weapon, with her going all out without any hesitation, it easily broke through the floor boss fire giant's thick skin, and blood gushed out instantly. It worked. At the very least, it didn't feel like striking the hardened crystalline shell on the back of a crystal lizard. If it could break through the defense, then, under the severe restriction imposed by this layer of gravity magic, the fire giant in front of them was nothing more than a large, living target, nothing more. Tiona's attack frequency was extremely high. Almost every strike left a shocking wound in the floor boss's arm, with dark red blood continuously flowing out. As for the other side of the battlefield, seeing her younger sister fighting this desperately, Tyon naturally couldn't hold back either. Compared to Tiona's wide, heavy swings, her first-class weapon, the short blade Zola's was destined for a fast-attack combat style when dealing with a floor boss. The tan-skinned girl moved with remarkable agility. Even within Futsuno Mitama's gravity field, Tyon kept adjusting her positioning, seeking a better angle for attack. But at that moment it seemed the pain had reached its limit. The towering fire giant before them had abandoned the idea of forcibly enduring the gravity magic. It planted both hands on the ground, forcing its upper body upright as much as possible. Immediately after, a massive spherical spell formed out of the evil god's flames beside the floor boss, radiating a terrifying heatwave. Not only that, the giant mouth located in the fire giant's abdomen began erupting like a volcano, continuously spreading those evil flames across the ground, trying to engulf the entire boss room in a sea of fire. As the heatwave swept over her, Tyon could clearly feel the tips of her hair curling, and her bare feet, stepping directly on the ground without shoes, were burning hot. This bastard is playing dirty. She pressed her already cracked lips together, her gaze locked firmly onto that condensing sphere of evil flame, but what happened next made her pupils shrink sharply. It wasn't attacking directly. Instead, it split into an uncountable number of fire projectiles, surging toward her position. There was no way she could take that head-on. She decisively pulled back to a safe distance, giving her body a brief chance to recover, but in the area ahead where her younger sister was, the The flames spreading from the fire giant's abdominal cavity to the ground had already formed an impenetrable barrier. Tyon could only vaguely see that blurred figure fighting within. This idiot. How can she get carried away while we're fighting a floor boss? That crimson flame, far fiercer than any furnace or campfire, seemed to carry an ominous aura. Even if the body could endure it head-on, it would definitely cause irreversible damage. Tyon cursed under her breath. She knew her sister's tendency to get carried away in battle, but in a situation like this, she couldn't just leave her alone. With that thought, the girl clenched her teeth, preparing to go in for a rescue when, from the corner of her eye, she caught sight of a familiar figure rushing toward the sea of flames at incredible speed. That figure, charging straight into the fire giant's sea of fire assault without the slightest hesitation, was something Tiona would never forget for the rest of her life. Ron. This guy, he really stakes his life in every single battle. And this time, his target was her little sister. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 202. Chapter 202. The final act of battle. Have you ever seen me at my peak? 1453 words. As a noble incantation caster, he was naturally supposed to provide fire support from the rear. After continuously casting incantation magic from a distance, Ron, who had been closely observing the battlefield, immediately noticed Tiona being trapped within the flames of the evil god. Could that kind of flame be endured head-on? Absolutely not. These were flames from a Souls-like boss out of the Elden Ring, fire that could be classified as belonging to an evil god under the Golden Order. Even the Erd Tree itself could be completely burned to ashes by it. What chance did mere flesh and blood have against that? Perfect timing. Let's test the stat boost that comes from absorbing these flames. So, even with a raging inferno ahead, Ron did not slow his advance in the slightest. Forcing every ounce of power out of his body, he burst forward at extreme speed. As for the obstruction created by the floor boss, he didn't care at all. Since he had chosen to burn his body in exchange for greater strength through power within, then this life was already something he had to stake. If he died, so be it. He rushed straight through the sea of fire. His clothes ignited instantly, and when the flames touched his skin, the searing pain made even Ron grit his teeth. Looking ahead, at the distant figure of the girl, swaying on the verge of collapse within the encroaching flames. This scene. For some reason, it felt strangely familiar. As if it had happened not long ago when he had exhausted his life force through the Godslayer's greatsword, and at the critical moment, it had been Tiona who caught him. Why does it feel like this world is just one big cycle, focused on battle? This trait was hard to call a flaw. It allowed Tiona to make better real-time judgments when facing monsters, bringing out even greater strength. But the downside was just as clear. Losing herself too deeply in combat could cause her to fall into danger without realizing it. In the past, she had always had her companions from the Loki familiar to pull her out. But now, things were different. Looking at the exposed white bones in the fire giant's arm, Tiona was satisfied with her attack. However, as the magical laurel armor gradually faded, feeling the heat waves sweeping in from all directions, and the wall of flames cutting off her retreat, her heart skipped violently. She scanned her surroundings. Even the rocky ground was cracking under the extreme heat, and stepping barefoot on it caused sharp pain. With the durability of a level 5 adventurer, she could endure it. But she had to find a way out. Anyway, I've got enough panacea. Injuries like this should be manageable, right? With that thought, Tiona didn't hesitate in the slightest. After all, she understood the principle, better a short pain than a long one. This way, she could at least preserve her combat capability. And just then, as if having lost its previous target, the floating sphere of evil god fire before the fire giant slowly turned toward her. Without any warning, a torrent of blazing flames poured out, forming a pillar of fire that surged straight toward Tiona. Not only that, the ground beneath her, which had barely been stable, began to split apart. From the widening cracks, magma-like, almost tangible flames erupted. Her escape route was completely sealed. So now it's my turn? She absolutely couldn't just stand there and wait for death. She forced herself to stay calm, but the range of that flame pillar was enormous. Within it, she could even sense a trace of annihilation. Even if it meant crossing a sea of fire. She had to push through. But things did not unfold the way she had hoped. The extreme heat surrounding the flames began to distort her vision. The scorching waves of heat were rapidly draining her stamina. Damn. I'm not seriously going to die on the 17th floor, am I? She tried to force her body to move. But her limbs simply refused to respond. A deep sense of danger filled her heart. Yet if one were to call it despair, it wasn't quite that. After all, the moment she became an adventurer, she had already anticipated a situation like this. Just as her consciousness began to blur and her body lost control, collapsing toward the ground, she suddenly felt an extremely solid shoulder bracing against her back. Tiona instinctively turned her head. Then, she saw the boy whose face looked like it was about to ignite on a physical level. His black hair had already completely burned away, leaving behind a charred, dark scalp. Ron. Why was it this guy? The girl opened her mouth, trying to speak, but even her voice came out hoarse. In front. I know that already. This was exactly what companions were for. Helping each other. Staring at the flames surging toward them, Ron decisively raised his arm. Power within, driving every last drop of magic power in his body, the incantation used at full force directly formed a barrier in front of him and Tiona, isolating the flames and heat. This faint yellow barrier was absorbing all of the evil god flames. Not only that, even the temperature of the surrounding sea of fire was visibly dropping. Until the inferno, born from the flames pouring out of the fire giant, completely vanished. Only then did he slowly lower his arm. The boost brought by this unprecedentedly powerful flame felt like it was about to tear his body apart entirely. Pain. An overwhelming, never-before-felt pain surged through him. Damn it. Old-school stuff really hits different. Ron tugged at the corner of his mouth. His skin, already charred black from the evil god flames, now seemed to have molten magma flowing beneath it, containing a violent, terrifying energy. This power even surpassed everything he had accumulated across all his adventurer levels. But it came at a cost. He could feel it, compared to the dragon flame he had absorbed from Landsoaks. The evil god flames were far more extreme, and far more destructive. You okay? The girl opened her eyes and looked at Ron, whose body was as black as charcoal. If she could speak clearly, Tiona would have said, "You should worry about yourself first." She gently shook her head, then with difficulty reached for the panacea at her waist. But instead of using it herself, she handed it to Ron. Want a drink? Forget it. Noticing Tyon had already arrived, Ron shook his head and glanced at the pair of short blades in the tan-skinned girl's hands. In terms of weapon grade, they were definitely better than his. Since he had decided to act as a suicide truck, then he might as well be the one with the biggest explosion. He took a deep breath, but the fibrosis in his lungs made him cough uncontrollably. Senior Tyon, your sister should be fine. Just needs a bit of rest. And also, could you lend me your weapon for a bit? Her sister was indeed fine. But the one who had taken everything head-on was Ron, a rookie adventurer whose strength was only level 3. That left Tyon with a complicated, conflicted feeling she couldn't quite describe. She gave a slight nod. But looking at the boy's miserable state, the hand that was about to pass him the blades slowly lowered. Her eyes were filled with complexity. In your current condition, you're clearly not fit to keep fighting. This fire giant, we should slow down the strategy. In the end, it came down to her and Tiona not being strong enough. Against a massive opponent like the fire giant, relying solely on close combat made it impossible to kill it. Who says I'm not fit? Relying on the tarnished template's recovery magic, he could push his HP to the limit. Even on the brink of death, he wouldn't immediately perish. It allowed the effect of power within to be prolonged, at the cost of enduring extreme pain. At this point, there was no way he could retreat. Looking at Tyon before him, compared to Tiona, she was the complete opposite, a far more voluptuous figure, a true tan-skinned beauty. Perhaps influenced by the evil god flames he had absorbed, even his personality showed slight changes. He tilted his head. Ron's charred face split into a grin, his white, even teeth forming a stark contrast against his current state. He felt overwhelmingly powerful, strong beyond belief. Tyon, have you ever seen me at my peak? I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 203. Chapter 203. Has Ron's magical mastery already surpassed hers? 1,288 words. Have you ever seen me at my peak? To be honest, Tyon really hadn't. Instead, what she had witnessed twice were moments where Ron was on the brink of death. Those miserable states left a far deeper impression on her. Burned into charcoal by flames, overdrawing his life force, like a dying old man on his last legs. And now, his entire body was pitch black, and she could even faintly see, beneath that skin, the scorching magma flowing inside, eerily similar to the flames of an evil god. I haven't. Words of thanks should come after the battle. Her emotions were extremely complicated as she reached out and handed the two short blades to the boy whose appearance had been completely altered. In this condition, and still going to fight. Tyon had already vaguely guessed that the pale yellow barrier which had absorbed that sea of flames and the floor boss's assault earlier, was likely Ron's trump card. A method that damages the body in exchange for a short-term, all-around boost in power. Could it be learned? Not a chance. Her voice turned hoarse. But you are a miracle unlike anything I've ever seen, as long as I'm not just a rare case. Looking at the pair of bright silver weapons in his hands, shaped like Nepalese kukris, Ron could immediately feel their solid weight the moment he held them. Compared to his own equipment, these were the real deal, genuine first-class weapons. At this point, wasting time meant cutting into his limited invincibility window. On top of that, Mikoto, who was maintaining the gravity magic, definitely couldn't sustain it for long. This had to be finished quickly. Feeling his body in its current ruin-like state, Ron raised his head, his gaze locking onto the eye embedded in the fire giant's chest, the one blasted open by the ancient dragon incantation, flesh torn apart and blood spraying. In Souls-like terms, you start by hacking at the fire giant's legs, then in Phase 2, you go for the arms. But there was no visible HP bar here. If he wanted to kill it efficiently, he had to strike the core. Mindless chip damage would only waste time. Staring at the towering mass of flesh before him, at that constantly rising and falling chest. Very quickly, Ron recalled how he had dealt with the floor boss Goblin Guard before, tear open the chest and completely destroy the heart. The moment the thought formed, he acted. Using the grappling hook fired from his shinobi prosthetic, the barbed claw embedded itself firmly into the fire giant's flesh. With the pulling force, and the full stat boost granted by absorbing the evil god's flames through power within, he kicked off with both legs and launched himself into the air. He shot straight toward the giant's chest. This is it. There was no foothold. But that didn't matter. Gripping the pair of kukris known as Zolas, Ron drove them hard into the skin. Pest. Compared to the short blades he used before, the sharpness wasn't even on the same level. They pierced through the fire giant's flesh like cutting butter, driving in until the tips struck bone. There was no resistance at all. Pressed almost flush against the fire giant, Ron found that the heat radiating from the boss's body was nothing compared to the evil god flames burning within him. He decisively cut the rope extending from the shinobi prosthetic, relying solely on the blades lodged into the giant's ribcage to anchor himself. Damn it. No way ripping your heart out won't kill you, right? As the floor boss raised its arm, attempting to smash him flat, Ron gritted his teeth. His eyes, flowing with evil god flames, were filled with ruthless resolve. He raised his other arm and drove the blade violently into the chest. Until it hit bone. Using his previous anchor point, Ron exerted all his strength and dragged his right hand downward. The thick skin and dense muscle were completely torn open by the razor-sharp blade. Not only that, even his body was now sliding down toward the ground. In an instant, a massive gash was torn completely open across the fire giant's chest. Pale, chilling bone mixed with shredded flesh was exposed, and one could even faintly glimpse that enormous, violently beating giant heart. What Ron had to do next was simple and clear. He drove the short blade in his right hand straight into his leg, one that was already on the verge of being reduced to charcoal, then raised his arm once more. Ancient Dragon Lightning Spear. This wasn't a game. The power of incantation magic would naturally diminish with distance. That was a fundamental rule even in the world of DanMachi. It still had to obey the principle of energy conservation. But at point-blank range, that limitation could be completely bypassed. Ron made no other move. He simply continued to draw upon the magic power within his body. With the full amplification from power within, his current state had already reached an unprecedented peak. Leaping red lightning. This was no longer mere electrical arcs, but lightning overflowing with violent, tyrannical power, completely enveloping his body like a Faraday cage. At last, the crimson lightning that had nearly illuminated half the boss chamber's upper sky vanished abruptly. In its place, a fully solidified lightning spear. Perish. Hurry, hurry up. Feeling the incoming pressure of the descending palm, Ron thrust forward with all his strength, driving the ancient dragon lightning spear in his hand straight toward the fire giant's chest, toward that fiercely beating heart. And as every last drop of magic within his body was squeezed dry, the lock-on life-preserving effect brought by heal collapsed completely under the overwhelming destructive force of the evil god's flames. His body, already breaking apart under the burning flames, fell straight toward the ground. As his consciousness was about to fade briefly, entering the state of the revival skill, that resounding explosion, that dazzling spectacle of crimson lightning like a grand firework display that was the salute welcoming Ron's return. Boom! The violent explosion of the ancient dragon lightning spear brought not only a deafening roar, but also a powerful shockwave in its aftermath, directly kicking up shattered stone and dust from the ground. The battle had happened quickly and ended just as suddenly. When the shockwave swept over, Lefia felt her head buzzing. Having continuously fired off Ark's ray for ranged support, her mind was already nearing exhaustion, and her vision gradually blurred. But when the elven girl saw that pitch-black figure, completely devoid of life, falling heavily toward the ground, her heart clenched painfully. Really, she didn't even know how to describe it. Burned beyond recognition by the sea of evil god flames, Ron hadn't fallen. Instead, he dragged his heavily wounded body forward and launched a counterattack against the fire giant. Relying on that bizarre mobility and a completely fearless, death-defying fighting style, he tore open the fire giant's chest. And then, directly detonated that ancient dragon lightning spear, condensed from immense magic power, point-blank at the boss's most vulnerable heart. This was probably what he had mentioned before, the final ripple. It really was outrageous. The destructive power unleashed by that lightning spear explosion, even from nearly 50 meters away, still made the elven girl's heart tremble uncontrollably. At the very least, in terms of raw damage. Even with the doubled amplification of attack magic from fairy cannon, Lefia knew she absolutely couldn't reach that level. She raised her head, looking at the floor boss fire giant as it crashed down and completely perished. The girl immediately stepped forward, but Tiona, who had already regained consciousness and fully recovered thanks to a panacea, was several times faster than her. Ron, I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. Patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 204, Chapter 204, Tiona's Hidden Feelings, an Everless Pursuit Squad? 1,247 words. Soul Shards plus 100. At last. Relying on 2 uses of revival, and after throwing out every last trump card while facing the floor boss, the fire giant, he had barely managed to defeat the monster. The reward was absolutely worth it. As his vitality was completely burned away, the side effects of absorbing the evil god's flames finally vanished as well. When a gentle light enveloped Ron's body. In an instant, the charred, pitch-black skin scorched by the sea of flames shed away like a cocoon breaking open, restoring itself to his original pale, smooth complexion. Even his hair had completely recovered. As for the backlash from power within, just how painful it had been. He really didn't want to recall it. He was honestly worried that kind of extreme pain might leave a psychological scar, making him afraid to self-detonate again in the future. Feeling the softness beneath his head and the faint fragrance that was different from a typical girl's wild style, Ron opened his eyes and immediately saw a familiar figure. Tiona. And the girl's eyes, filled with unmistakable concern. Nothing serious. Just a minor fatal wound, he said casually, adjusting himself into a more comfortable lap pillow position, his tone completely relaxed. A fatal wound. Just a bit harder to kill, that's all. Thank you. This guy was really something else. Whether it was the secrets he carried, or the way he acted. No matter what, Tiona knew she would never forget. That moment when she was about to be swallowed by the evil god's sea of flames. That figure who stepped forward without hesitation, appearing behind her, steady and dependable, saving her at the brink of danger. Without Ron's help, she didn't even dare imagine what would have happened. There was no doubt. Ron's intervention had, in effect, saved the entire expedition party from disaster. Though, best not ask how that disaster came about in the first place. A hero. On Ron, Tiona seemed to see the shadow of that great hero from the Argonaut storybook. The girl murmured softly. Noticing the slight furrow in his brows, she hesitated for a moment before gently reaching out and pressing her fingers against his temples. The battle is already over. It had to be. He had even used up all his revival charges. If he still hadn't managed to kill the fire giant after that, then Ron would have truly been out of options. He'd have had no choice but to consider retreating from the boss room with the expedition team. But now, it was time to enjoy a beautiful girl's lap pillow and massage service. However, when the corner of his eye caught sight of the expedition party approaching from the distance, the smile at the edge of his lips quickly faded, his expression turning serious. Next. I think we seriously need to rest. Tyon had wanted to thank Ron for helping her sister at such a critical moment. But looking at the two of them in their current state, she ultimately held back. Especially when she noticed that gentle expression on Tiona's face, something she had never seen before. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were developing in a direction far beyond her expectations. Something was definitely off, but that didn't affect the extremely high regard Tyon now held for Ron. If not for the difference in skin tone, she might have suspected that this guy actually possessed Amazoness battle blood. His technique was certainly there. If she had to describe it, it was unprecedentedly simple and brutal. Fighting on the edge of death, trading injury for life, self-destruction tactics. She even felt a bit relieved. Fortunately, the Loki familiar's relationship with Ron would likely grow closer through this expedition. And the bond forming between him and her sister, Tiona. Otherwise, just imagining an adventurer with talent comparable to a monster and such an extremely ferocious combat style becoming a future opponent, was enough to give Tyon a splitting headache. Good work. Thanks. We're expedition partners. Even if it's temporary for now, there's no need to worry about my condition. If I can still chat with you like this, it means I'm doing just fine. Formalities had to be dropped. Ron looked at the hesitant elf girl, Lefia, as well as Daphne and Cassandra, who had basically played no role in this battle. From their eyes, he could more or less guess what they were thinking. Don't put any psychological pressure on yourselves. You just went through a dungeon anomaly not long ago and are still in a phase of improving your strength. I believe that in the future, you'll definitely be able to keep up. We'll work hard, Captain Ron. This was leagues better than the Apollo familiar. Daphne looked at Ron, who was currently resting his head on Tiona's thighs. After hesitating for a moment, she asked, "Where are we heading next?" "If we go further down, there's a safe floor. It'll be much more convenient to rest and recover there." "I have no objections." Ron glanced around at the members of the expedition party. This battle had drained them immensely. Fatigue was clearly visible on their faces. Especially Mikoto. As the key person responsible for restraining the floor boss, the fire giant, her continuous use of gravity magic had left her face extremely pale. Seemingly noticing Ron's gaze, Mikoto nodded lightly, then as if remembering something, added, "If we're talking about resting, we can go to the safe floor on the 18th floor, but this kind of physical exhaustion, it definitely won't be relieved in a short time." At this point, The girl from the Far East had a look of expectation in her clear eyes. However, I do know a way to quickly relieve fatigue. When we were heading to the boss room, I discovered a cave passage in the 15th floor area that had a sulfur smell like a hot spring. So, should we go check it out later? A man doesn't refuse a hot spring. But looking at all the beautiful girls present, Ron fell silent. He suddenly realized. He had absolutely no reason to refuse. Sounds good. However, just as the expedition party made their decision to head to the safe floor on the 18th floor for a short rest, and once recovered, go to the 15th floor to enjoy the hot spring. From the distant rear, within the cave passage that led directly to the boss room, hurried footsteps could be heard. What's that? Did adventurers from the 18th floor notice the disturbance and come over? Daphne quickly arrived at that conclusion. However, when she looked in the direction the footsteps were coming from, what entered her sight were more than 10 unfamiliar adventurers she had never seen before. When a floor boss is being challenged, the noise is bound to attract attention. But now, it was already over. Just as Daphne was thinking about how to brush this off, the group of adventurers blocking the passage out of the boss room ahead wore playful smiles filled with naked malice. And, from the weapons they were drawing one after another, it was already clear. They weren't here because of the floor boss disturbance. To be precise, their target was this expedition party. Captain. Looks like before we go soak in the hot spring, there's something more urgent we need to deal with first. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 205, Chapter 205, The Giant's Red Braid and Complete Mastery of the Fire Giant's Incantations. 1,258 words. Following Filvis's instructions, the man codenamed Silencer, Mason Adler, led his fellow familiar members to the 17th floor in search of their target adventurer. As for the appearance of the floor boss, the fire giant, and the commotion caused by the battle, they needed no guidance. Very quickly, they followed the cave tunnels, located the boss room, and personally witnessed a monster unlike anything they had ever seen before in all their exploration. The fire giant. Its appearance completely overturned their understanding of the floor boss Goliath. Its abdomen resembled a volcanic crater, continuously spewing flames into the chamber. Most crucially, among the adventurers currently fighting this mutated floor boss were quite a few familiar faces. Core members of the largest faction, the Loki Familiar. Even the 2 LV.5 Amazonas adventurers were present, along with Lefia, one of their main midline forces. What is going on here? Mason stood at a distance. As one of the few remaining LV.4 adventurers in his familiar and the leader of this team, he frowned as he observed the situation. If this were simply a standard raid by the Loki Familiar against a mutated floor boss, he would have immediately disbanded the team and fled in separate directions without hesitation. From a pure strength standpoint, they were completely outmatched. And if their true identities were exposed, they would very likely be hunted down. After all, Evolus, compared to Aurario, was like cockroaches in the sores. Almost everyone present had a bounty on their head at the guild. However, within the crowd, Adler spotted a face he knew all too well. The same individual who had repeatedly stirred upheaval across Aurario, the very target of this mission. Ron. Why? Why is this guy cooperating with the Loki Familiar to clear the dungeon? This completely contradicted the intelligence provided by Filvis. Ron's Hestia Familiar was supposed to be preparing for the dungeon expedition, with a lineup consisting of only 2 LV.3 adventurers and the rest being LV.2. Because of that, Adler had even thought Filvis was making a mountain out of a molehill. Even if Ron was unusually strong, 3 LV.4 adventurers working together would be more than enough. Besides, their objective was merely to force him back to the safe zone on the 18th floor. That should have been completely feasible. But now, Adler's expression turned complicated. The target was right in front of him, yet he could do nothing. The sheer number of adventurers present made any move too conspicuous. So, do we still have time to withdraw? Ron and the others in the distance had already noticed their presence, causing the already tense atmosphere inside the boss room to tighten to the breaking point. The air shimmered with heat from the hellfire, waves of scorching air rising continuously. Even though the battle against the mutated floor boss had drained the adventurers somewhat, they all clearly understood the gap in strength between levels. If you don't want to die, then move your legs faster. Especially when, as Ron rose from Tiona's lap pillow, the furious look in his eyes, Adler felt a chill run down his spine, as if needles were pricking his back. For some reason, he had the distinct feeling that this guy harbored an inexplicable hatred toward him. They had to run. Just the Hiryute sisters from the Loki familiar alone could easily wipe out his team. Not to mention all the other adventurers present. Run. The mission intel was obviously inaccurate. If they stayed here any longer, they would just be idiots waiting to die. Naturally, Adler had no intention of doing something like that, nor did the familiar members behind him. Having spent years surviving in the dungeon, as remnants who had escaped the purge of the Dark Age, no one understood the art of running away better than they did. After all, Ron was here. Tiona restrained herself quite a bit from saying anything outrageous. She merely stared into the distance at the adventurers who had drawn their weapons and approached aggressively only to turn around and flee moments later. She frowned, utterly confused. They came all the way here just to chicken out. Most likely the fire giant floor boss caused too much commotion and attracted the attention of adventurers from the 18th floor safe zone. Daphne's gaze was equally thoughtful. Situations like this were not especially uncommon in Ororio. Most adventurers followed the unspoken rules of dungeon exploration. Don't steal other people's prey. However, there would always be adventurers unwilling to follow the rules, trying to snatch a bit of profit for themselves. After all, a great feat was something exceedingly rare for ordinary adventurers. But they probably recognized us. And since the floor boss is already dead, they didn't want to start a conflict. Not everything could be judged based on the original DanMachi storyline. At the very least, the butterfly effect caused by his own existence had already triggered plenty of chain reactions. Listening to Daphne's analysis, the logic behind it was at least internally consistent. Ron lightly shook his head. Hopefully. At the very least, we can't afford any more unexpected trouble today. He had already used up all of his remaining revival charges today. During the rest of the journey, his ability to handle unforeseen danger would be extremely low. They absolutely could not afford further complications. Ron looked toward the women present. After intense exploration, rushing between floors to provide support, and enduring the hellish environment created by the fire giant, visible exhaustion could already be seen on their faces. Still, their strength was what mattered most. As long as they did not encounter another floor boss, safety would not be an issue. More importantly, this dungeon expedition had already exceeded Ron's expectations in terms of efficiency. The path leading to the boss room extended directly into the 17th floor region, saving them a tremendous amount of time that would otherwise have been spent exterminating souls-like monsters. And on top of that, they had reunited with Tyon, Daphne, and the others without issue, saving them the trouble of searching for companions. Ron swept his gaze across the group. Compared to retreating, there was still one extremely important matter he needed to handle first. Next, we'll head to the 18th floor safe zone and get some proper rest. But before that, we need to collect the rewards from clearing the floor boss. The profits from the drop items would be distributed according to the standard ratio. But what Ron cared about most was whether defeating the fire giant would drop something like an Ash of War or an incantation. Then, what entered his sight first was an enormous dark purple magic stone, seemingly containing endless magical power within it. Its color was incomparably deep. And second, his attention was drawn to the whip lying on the ground, woven from the fire giant's crimson hair. After all, the DanMachi world had no remembrance system. So directly dropping the giant's red braid honestly felt pretty reasonable. At least, all those revival charges weren't wasted for nothing. Only now did the effort he had invested finally feel proportional to the rewards he had earned. And no one was happier about that than Ron. Continuously growing stronger inside the dungeon was the very thing that drove him forward. Not only that, the moment he bent down and picked up the giant's red braid, the incantations born from the fire giant's faith began flooding endlessly into the depths of his mind. Achem. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 206, Chapter 206, Filvis. Could Ron be a creature too? 1,424 words. The names of the incantations were admittedly a bit too hot-blooded and meathead. Flame, fall upon them. Giant's flame, take thee. Flame of the fell god. Burn, O flame. But that didn't mean the fire giant's incantations were weak. After all, these were the ashen flames capable of burning the Erd tree itself. Even if the world of DanMachi didn't actually have an Erd tree. At the very least, the hard-working pedicure specialist who had spent half the day working on the fire giant's feet had finally received the reward he deserved. The fire giant's braided red hair paired with the burn, O flame, incantation. Anyone who had experienced that combination would understand what it meant for joy to never fade. Thanks to the character save slot's Elden Ring-style weapon mastery ability, even a flexible whip weapon he had never touched before felt strangely familiar the moment he held it in his hand. With only a little practice, he could completely master how to use it. Materials like the fire giant's leg bones and the giant's red hair that remained behind even after the floor boss perished were all excellent crafting materials for forging equipment. The expedition's profits were effectively secured. This should sell for quite a lot of Valis. And if anyone wants equipment made, we can just provide the raw materials directly. After packing up all the dropped materials, there was no reason to continue staying there. And once they left the scorching floor boss chamber behind, perhaps because of the fire giant's death, that intense sense of unease that had constantly lingered deep within Ron's heart was slowly fading away. The most direct sign was the obvious change in the cave passages. Unlike the earlier labyrinth, which had felt as though it wanted to trap him here and kill him outright. Pretty nice. Looks like the dungeon knows when to surrender to the strong. To prevent this from being some kind of illusion created by the dungeon, making people think everything was fine while secretly arranging some lurking bastard to shoot arrows from the shadows. Ron deliberately slowed his pace and walked at the very back of the party. None of the other expedition members had any objections to this arrangement. After all, during the battle against the fire giant earlier, he had been the primary damage dealer. Using a completely reckless fighting style, he had forcibly traded his life for the floor bosses. Want some water? Elfie had to admit it. At the beginning, she had spoken a little too loudly. They were both adventurers, yet when she looked at Ron, the gap between them felt like an uncrossable chasm. And it wasn't just talent. More than that, it was his attitude toward adventuring itself. She knew very clearly that no matter what, she could never fight like that. Nor could she charge forward with that kind of resolve to face death head-on. But this familiar expedition had still been rewarding for her. At the very least, she had finally witnessed the sheer variety of monsters Ron regularly encountered during his everyday dungeon explorations, as well as the absurd level of danger, practically armed to the teeth. To Elfie, it had been an incredibly fresh and thrilling experience. Thanks. Ron casually accepted the water skin the brown-haired girl handed over, without questioning her intentions. Walking at the rear of the expedition party, the moment he stepped out of the floor boss chamber and continued forward for a short while, a familiar sensation of being watched slowly crept over him once more. Not far behind him. Within that deep darkness the eye could not penetrate, it felt as though a figure was silently observing him. And the instant Ron turned to look, that figure immediately melted back into the darkness, as though everything had merely been his imagination. Honestly speaking, Ron considered himself someone severely lacking in a sense of security. Otherwise, he would never have been so desperately obsessed with growing stronger in Rio. But burdened by the secrets he carried, and everything happening behind the scenes, Ron constantly felt as though an invisible hand was steadily pushing events forward. As for the figure secretly watching him from afar, was it the goddess of beauty, Freya? Or perhaps the remnants of Evelus lurking in the shadows, waiting to make their move? The answer honestly wasn't difficult to guess. At the end of the day, it all came down to the speed at which his strength had grown, along with the secrets he carried behind him. Would anyone truly not be curious? Facing Elphys' curious gaze, Ron did not explain much. He simply quickened his pace to catch up with the expedition party. Still, he had clearly become more vigilant about this unexpected incident. Hopefully it's just my imagination. He seemed to notice me just now. Hidden within the observation platform above the floor boss chamber, Phylvis tilted her head slightly. Her crimson eyes were currently filled with deep confusion. Entrusting such an important mission to Adler and the other members of Evolus was obviously not reassuring. More importantly, the disturbance caused on floor 17 had been far too exaggerated. Even in Rivera, the safe floor district, many adventurers had grown curious about it. Naturally, Phylvis could not simply stay behind. Thanks to the convenience granted by her status as a creature, the black-haired elf girl had rapidly arrived at the battlefield. Unfortunately, by the time she got there, the battle was already nearing its end. It was a monster she had never seen before. Unlike Goliath, this thing seemed to have undergone a complete change in species itself. To achieve something like that, the only explanation she could think of was the secret Ron carried. If danger appeared, she could always step in under the identity of an ordinary adventurer. In her fully creature-transformed state, possessing LV.7 level power, killing the fire giant would have been extremely simple. But because of the other adventurers present, Phylvis had not done so. She still needed this identity in order to continue moving around Rio. Yet what truly shocked the girl was Ron himself, desperately fighting the mutated floor boss to the death. Shocking. But not because of the strength he possessed. In Phylvis's eyes, the power Ron could unleash in his limit-breaking state was, at most, at the peak of LV.4. And it couldn't even last very long. An overwhelming burst of strength. But once it ended, he'd immediately be finished. Watching Ron squeeze every last drop from his body in exchange for a brief explosion of power, only to lose all signs of life afterward. For a moment, Phylvis had genuinely thought that Dionysus's mission was going to fail. But then, she witnessed it with her own eyes. Ron's body, burned into charcoal, recovering to normal in an incredibly short period of time. That near-immortal characteristic. Seriously, this feeling is way too familiar. The side effect of repeatedly using clone magic was that the black-haired elf girl's mental state had become extremely unstable. And under the god's brainwashing, she had gradually forgotten many of her memories. However, from Ron's revival, Phylvis saw echoes of her former self. Trying every possible method to commit suicide, yet unable to die because of her identity as a creature. So, Ron's a creature too? Adventurers died when they were killed. And before her own death, she had once been alive as well. Now she merely continued existing in another form. Because of that, the black-haired elf girl arrived at a bold conclusion. Even that sense of belonging she had never once received from the god Dionysus. Phylvis saw a faint possibility of finding it in Ron, someone she considered a kindred spirit. Maybe things really are exactly as I guessed. She needed to personally make contact with him before she could obtain the real answer. As for the plan Dionysus had arranged, there was no longer any reason to continue it. Massacring the innocent adventurers of Rivera. Phylvis could feel resistance to the idea rising from deep within her subconscious. Perhaps the original owner of this body had once been an exceptionally kind and helpful person. Watching the expedition party gradually disappear into the distance. That cold, beautiful face of hers, usually so icy and unapproachable, unexpectedly revealed an emotion that almost never appeared on it. Urgency. So, if two creatures met each other, how exactly was she supposed to greet him? I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 207, Chapter 207, Safe Floor Evolus members infiltrating Rivera? 1,388 words. The safe floor. Compared to how it was depicted in the original DanMachi, only seeing it in person could truly convey how breathtaking it was. The environment here was completely different from the previous floors. It was unbelievably spacious. Under the vast clusters of crystals overhead, warm sunlight poured across the entire region, forming a unique ecosystem deep within the dungeon. At the very least. When Ron arrived on this floor, he didn't feel that familiar sense of danger. Which only proved one thing. After his despicable outsider effect had already forced him into an early showdown against the fire giant, there was no way the dungeon would immediately pull another massive stunt on floor 18. Breathing in the scent of leaves and damp earth mingling in the air, Ron finally felt his tightly wound nerves ease for the first time. The exhaustion brought by non-stop combat crashed over him like a tidal wave. I seriously need to rest my ass off. As for when they left floor 17, he hadn't forgotten the figure watching him from behind. But he could tell one thing: the other party hadn't radiated any strong hostility. Otherwise, just like when he encountered that earlier group of adventurers, he definitely would have felt a bad premonition. We'll rest on the safe floor for today. We're only 4 floors away from our expedition target. Our progress is already much faster than expected. As for what came next, since this was his first time reaching this area, Ron didn't really have any concrete plans. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Daphne. Leave this kind of thing to her, and there absolutely wouldn't be any problems. She had extensive experience leading parties, and she was willing to help others when danger appeared. Those 2 points alone had already proven she was a trustworthy companion. Then we won't be going into Rivera. Anyone who had ever reached floor 18 knew exactly how absurdly overpriced everything there was. Equipment repairs and food supplies were sold at outrageous prices. And because their expedition had progressed ahead of schedule, there wasn't really any need to restock supplies at all. Daphne shifted her gaze toward the wide-open grasslands outside Rivera. This was the area adventurer parties usually used for temporary campsites. As for the rest, just treat it as free time. Her eyes swept across the group. After all, with adventurers from the Loki familiar still present, she didn't make any further arrangements. Even Mikoto's earlier suggestion about visiting the hot springs was postponed. At the very least, it would have to wait until evening. Logic told her that during a dungeon expedition, it was best to avoid unnecessary complications whenever possible. But only those who had actually fought these mutated monsters could understand how exhausting it truly was. The deeper they explored, the stronger the monsters they encountered would become. And now that they had an opportunity to relieve some of that fatigue, there was no way she intended to let it pass by. Later tonight, Senior Mikoto will lead the way. Anyone who wants to visit the hot springs can gather together then. Ron naturally had no objections to this arrangement. No one understood better than him just how utterly cursed a Souls-like dungeon could be. The fact that the goddamn dungeon hadn't already killed him could only be considered proof that he was unusually hard to kill. So, after working non-stop for so long, Master Ron taking some time to enjoy a little relaxation and its accompanying perks absolutely wasn't a problem. Little sister, what's the plan now? It was a rare moment of downtime. More importantly, Tyon had a lot she wanted to talk to her sister about assisting the Hestia familiar during this expedition, and about everything that happened after they got separated. Naturally, none of that was appropriate to discuss in front of Ron. So she used the excuse of needing to restock supplies and headed toward Rivera to find somewhere else to talk. Though calling it a town was inaccurate, it was closer to a giant shanty town. Compared to Ororio, the architectural style here looked completely makeshift, like some slapped-together amateur construction crew had thrown it up overnight. Walking through Rivera, the Amazoness girl looked at the adventurers on both sides of the street, busy hammering away at equipment and preparing potions, before Tyon was the first to break the silence. Tiona, can you tell me what exactly you and Ron ran into while acting separately? As for why she wasn't asking Lefia, don't make me laugh. As much as she hated to admit it, Lefia's relationship with Ron would only remain neutral as long as familiar interests were involved. Sure enough, it was this critical, impossible-to-ignore issue. After all, following such a short separation, Ron had somehow ended up with a spiral greatsword out of nowhere. Anyone paying even slight attention could tell their exploration hadn't been simple. Under her sister's gaze, Tiona only felt a headache coming on. Fortunately, Ron hadn't forbidden the information from being shared. After finding a completely quiet area where no one could spy on them, her expression turned complicated as she answered seriously. In Ron's words, We basically went to another world that was on the verge of destruction. Since she had never personally experienced the world beyond the fog gate, Tyon frowned in confusion the instant she heard that answer. She recognized every word individually. But when combined together, she couldn't understand it at all. That's basically what happened. Back then, the mechanism transported us to floor 17, where we encountered a lot of monsters we'd never seen before, along with that fog gate. After passing through that fog gate, it really felt like we'd gone to another world. Worried that her sister wouldn't understand, Tiona explained everything in extreme detail. But when she recalled the Ash Judge after the outbreak of the Pus of Man virus, a deep chill rose uncontrollably from within her heart. Over there, we encountered a completely unprecedented floor boss, the Ash Judge. It was terrifying. After the virus outbreak, its body became horribly mutated. And after Ron killed the floor boss, the virus started spreading like a plague. The overwhelming flood of information came one after another, leaving Tyon standing there blankly with a grave expression. A fog gate leading to another world. A virus capable of causing grotesque mutations. A world on the brink of destruction. It sounded like pure fantasy. But Tyon knew perfectly well that her sister would never lie to her. And that meant the secrets Ron possessed, even the things currently being shown to them, were merely things he had no intention of hiding. But it's better not to go to a place like that. It's way too dangerous. Recalling the black tadpole-like creatures swarming toward them after the Pus of Man aberrations were killed, Tiona felt her scalp go numb all over again. Those things were the contamination source responsible for spreading the Pus of Man virus. If they had been even slightly careless. Just remembering that scene was enough to make her shudder. Once infected with the Pus of Man virus, there's absolutely no way to cure it. Once the virus erupts, you'll become a mutated creature that loses all consciousness and gets controlled. Even after saying that, she still didn't forget to add, this absolutely cannot be leaked to anyone else. Why was she the one being warned by her little sister now? Even from the brief description alone, Tyon could already sense how dangerous it was. And what her deep gaze was currently pondering was whether the choice made by the Loki familiar had truly been the correct one. She lightly shook her head. If Captain Finn were here, he definitely would have thought through the matter much more thoroughly. And just as the girl decided to change the subject and ease her mood a little, the corner of Tyon's eye suddenly caught sight of several adventurers entering Rivera from the distance ahead. They looked familiar. Hey, if I remember correctly, those guys are the same group that tried to make a move on us inside the floor boss chamber before getting scared off and running away, right? I will post some extra chapters in Patreon. You can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 208. Chapter 208. The Rivera Massacre Incident, Filvis's Resolve. 1,301 words. How are these people here? Honestly speaking, Tyon was pretty biased against this bunch. The only reason no conflict had broken out before was because they lacked the strength to do anything and had recognized her identity. If she and the others hadn't been present, then this group, drawn over by the floor boss, the fire giant, would have inevitably relied on sheer numbers to launch an assault against the Hestia familiar. So this should be the place, right? The sudden interruption cut off what Tiona had been about to say. Watching that group split up and disperse throughout the safe floor, the Amazonas girl faintly felt that something about them was strange. But even after thinking carefully about it, she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Should be. It should be fine. Physical and mental exhaustion alone normally wouldn't cause such an obvious drop in combat ability. And as a midway checkpoint within the middle floors, the safe floor wasn't the kind of place where especially powerful adventurers would hole up waiting to stir up trouble. Tiona lightly shook her head. Compared to all that the moment Ron disappeared from her sight, the girl found herself overcome with a strange, indescribable emotion. Facing the fire giant's assault, if he hadn't stepped forward when he did, then the consequences would have been unimaginable. That sea of evil god flames had seemed capable of burning absolutely everything to ash, yet the golden magic barrier Ron deployed had completely absorbed it all. Otherwise, the one reduced to charcoal would have been her. I should probably thank him, right? After arriving at the safe floor, She never even got the chance to spend time alone with Ron before her sister, Tyon, dragged her away and explained everything. Which meant what she needed to do next was actually pretty simple. There was no need to overthink it. Battles were exciting, and people who helped her were good people. Someone who had saved her life. That was a good person among good people. As the older sister, Tyon was clearly much more meticulous, and knowing her younger sister so well, she could immediately tell what Tiona was thinking just by looking at her expression. Whether from the standpoint of the familiar or as family, she had no reason to interfere in something like this. Go on. There's still time now anyway. Once the familiar expedition sets out again, you won't get another chance. If she really had to say something, then it would probably be this. Ron's luck with women was just way too ridiculous. All right. Tiona nodded heavily. But the moment she imagined what she was about to do next, the girl, who usually considered herself very straightforward, unexpectedly felt nervous. This nervousness was completely different from exploring the dungeon. Her heartbeat was simply accelerating for no reason at all. And then a violent explosion suddenly erupted from deep within Rivera, startling the tan-skinned Amazoness so badly that she jolted and whipped her head around. Boom! Not far behind them, the entire settlement of makeshift shacks that formed Rivera seemed to ignite all at once, as though explosives planted in advance had been detonated simultaneously. The explosion instantly blasted countless buildings apart. And due to the district's cramped, tangled layout, the surrounding structures were quickly set ablaze as well. Towering flames surged upward within the safe floor, billowing thick black smoke into the air. The deafening curses of adventurers and the frantic attempts to organize firefighting efforts threw all of Rivera into utter chaos. Holy shit! What the hell is happening? Standing atop a higher vantage point, Tyon frowned deeply as she stared at the streets that were on the verge of being swallowed by flames. There was absolutely no way an explosion like this was accidental. And the fire was still spreading rapidly toward the farther sections of the district. So, was this a premeditated suicide attack orchestrated by Evelus? Until her gaze landed on the final destination of the bombing attack, the familiar encampment being used for this joint expedition. The girl instantly felt chills run down her spine. Realizing the kind of uniqueness Ron possessed, even the dormant Evelus had begun taking action. Get back there. The one who reacted even faster than her was Tiona, whose figure shot forward with the agility of a leopard. Her short black hair fluttered wildly behind her, making the Amazoness girl look overflowing with untamed ferocity. Like a seasoned hunter emerging from the Amazon rainforest, she didn't choose the normal roads at all. Instead, she directly sprinted across the rooftops of the shanty town, advancing toward Ron at the shortest possible distance and the fastest possible speed. The wild instincts flowing through the girl's veins were screaming a warning. This explosion was absolutely a premeditated operation. And the only possible target was Ron, the man she had personally witnessed creating miracle after miracle. This time, I'll definitely make it in time. Looking at the massive commotion in Rivera caused by the explosions, there was no need to think about it to know the culprits had to be Adler and his group. Standing in a corner, the tightly furrowed brows of Filvis already proved just how terrible her mood currently was. After leaving the floor boss chamber on the 17th floor, the first people she sought out were the Evelus adventurers who had failed the mission, ordering them to stop the operation immediately. If Ron had merely been a chess piece in Lord Dionysus' rampage plan, then she could have carried out this operation without the slightest burden. But after witnessing that battle against the fire giant, she had already abandoned that line of thinking. Ron was absolutely not an ordinary genius adventurer. A creature. That was what her companions were. Someone who had clearly died, yet could revive again in a short period of time. That was a trait only creatures possessed. And on top of that, there was Ron's talent. Using only a single month to grow from a rookie into someone at LV.3. That alone further confirmed Filvis's suspicions. Only a creature could possess talent like that. As for what exactly would change after finding Ron, she hadn't thought that far ahead. At the very least, if they huddled together for warmth, perhaps she could finally find a faint sense of belonging. And through Ron, maybe she could learn how to properly interact with other adventurers. That was enough. Trying to encounter another creature, another one of my kind, in Rio really is so difficult. As a pawn of Lord Dionysus, she was surrounded by plenty of disgusting cockroaches from Everless, but actual creatures? She had barely seen any. Looking into the distance, at the explosions spreading toward the area where Ron was located, the black-haired elf girl felt an indescribable irritation welling up deep inside her heart. Even though she had already ordered the operation stopped, even if that counted as going against Lord Dionysus' plan, she still hoped that she could approach creature Ron in a normal way. In that case, those cockroaches really don't have any reason to keep existing. Filvis did not go looking for Ron. Instead, she drew the slender sword hanging at her waist and looked toward the center of the chaos, her eyes filled with killing intent. There would always be opportunities to meet Ron again in the dungeon later. Right now, what she needed to do was stop this riot. As for the future, the black-haired elf girl was undoubtedly lost and uncertain. But when she encountered Ron, someone who was the same kind as her, it felt as though she had glimpsed a path she had never seen before. So, she would not allow anyone to harm the Ron who had shown her that hope. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 209, Chapter 209, First Encounter with Filvis. 1292 words. Ron. What the hell is going on now? Compared to Rio, the safe floor was actually pretty cramped. Any slightly larger disturbance was hard to hide, let alone explosions. One after another, blasts continued to erupt without pause. And even more so, the explosions had directly spread from the outer edge of Rivera all the way toward the area where the familiar expedition camps were stationed. Under those circumstances, there was no way people wouldn't notice. Looking toward the distant black smoke continuously rising ahead of them. To put it bluntly, those flames were absolutely capable of burning all of Rivera to the ground. There was no way an ordinary fire could create this kind of commotion. As for the reason behind it, there was no need to guess at all. Fuck. Don't tell me this is aimed at me again. Back when they had left the floor boss chamber on the 17th floor, that hidden observer lurking in the shadows, someone who hadn't revealed much hostility, had already served as a warning sign for Ron. And now, they had only just arrived at the safe floor and hadn't even gotten a chance to properly rest before this previously peaceful street was suddenly thrown into chaos by such an outrageous incident. Staring at the distance ahead, Ron's expression became extremely grave. This definitely didn't feel like something arranged by the dungeon itself. As for the exact reason, though, he still had no clue. Nothing could be allowed to go wrong. Time flowed inside the safe floor almost the same as it did outside in Rio. If the cooldown on revival had already refreshed, then as his final insurance policy, Ron actually wasn't too worried about his own safety. But what about now? Even the two LV.5 senior adventurers from the Loki Familiar assisting them had already been dragged into this mess. He only had one last chance for error remaining. So annoying. Let's not head over there for now. A fire would inevitably throw people into chaos. If danger approached amidst all that confusion, using those adventurers as cover, it would be difficult to detect in time. And the saying "a wise man does not stand beneath a collapsing wall" certainly existed for a reason. Besides, Ron didn't think he was a gentleman anyway. All right. Then we'll follow your lead, Captain Ron. Most of the Familiar's main combat power had already been scattered elsewhere. Daphne even had a strong intuition that the flames triggered by those explosions would ultimately spread toward the area where Ron currently was. If it had been anyone else, she might not have thought that way. But after personally witnessing the miracles Ron had created, this kind of thing somehow felt completely natural. And now, this was exactly the moment to make use of her own strengths. Back when she had served as a commander in the former Apollo Familiar, Daphne had dealt with Rivera quite a few times. Though most of the time, it had been adventurers from the settlement trying to join parties challenging the floor boss Goliath, paying compensation in exchange for a chance to piggyback on the achievement of the kill. She wasn't worried about her captain's safety. After all, his strength was there for everyone to see. But rather than sitting here waiting for the situation to calm down, it would be better to use her connections to gather information firsthand. That way, they could seize the initiative instead of remaining passive. Thinking that, Daphne decisively stood up. I'll go ask around. They should know. What exactly happened in Rivera? Cassandra, your combat ability isn't good enough, so stay here with Captain Ron and Miss Mikoto. She quickly assigned everyone their roles. Immediately afterward, the girl's agile figure headed straight toward Rivera. This was the role she could contribute to the Hestia Familia under special circumstances. In the central area of the safe floor, the flames rising from the explosions had thrown all of Rivera into complete chaos. Adventurers busy trying to put out the fires could be seen everywhere. The noisy commotion filled Daphne's ears as she frowned and carefully observed the surroundings. And even more so, from somewhere in the distance ahead, the girl could hear the sounds of fighting and slaughter. But by the time she pushed through the crowd, all that remained before Daphne was the corpse of a slain adventurer. Killed instantly. The adventurer's heart had been pierced straight through in a single strike. Blood spread across the muddy ground from the wound, while the metallic scent of blood filled the air itself. What the hell happened here? To end a fight that cleanly and decisively, overwhelming strength was required. Not only that, Daphne even found the dead adventurer vaguely familiar, as though she had seen him before in the floor boss chamber on the 17th floor. Could it be the two senior members from the Loki Familia? However, the moment that thought surfaced, she immediately dismissed it. As members of one of Arario's top familiars, they shouldn't go that far. If news of something like that spread, the negative consequences would be enormous. Chem. So it's Commander Daphne. Among the crowd of adventurers gathered around the murder scene, one adventurer recognized Daphne and took the initiative to greet her before explaining, "That guy." According to that senior adventurer, he was one of the surviving remnants of the Evolus Rudra Familia. The explosions in Rivera were caused by them. Fuck. My damn shop finally started doing well, and now it got caught up in all this. Who the hell's gonna compensate me? The chaotic discussions and complaints continuously gathered together, forming a dense stream of information. An attack by surviving remnants of Evolus. That was the conclusion Daphne pieced together. There was no way this was a coincidence. Why had chaos erupted the moment the Hestia Familia arrived here? The instant that thought crossed her mind, alarm bells immediately went off in the girl's head. So the disturbance in Rivera was meant to lure them away and create an opportunity to abduct Ron? She had to go back. Without stopping for even a moment, Daphne directly drew the slender sword at her waist to force a path through the adventurers crowding toward her. Her gaze was sharp and murderous, to the point that the adventurers clogging the street instinctively moved aside and opened a path for her. I just hope that Senior Tiona and the others realize it too. Things unfolded exactly as Daphne had guessed. Philvis was far too familiar with the aura carried by these Evolus members. As a result, the speed at which she slaughtered them was even faster than expected, preventing the massacre of innocent adventurers from escalating further. And afterward, once she noticed that there were not many adventurers remaining around Ron, with most of them having been drawn away by the chaos in Rivera, she finally made her move. She understood that this might be one of the few natural opportunities she would have to come into contact with him. The girl made no effort to disguise herself. Holding a slender sword in one hand, after slaughtering those expendable Evolus adventurers, blood slowly dripped from the blade's fuller onto the grassy ground below. Faced with Ron's extremely high level of vigilance, the black-haired elf girl hesitated briefly before taking the initiative to show her intentions. The explosions in Rivera were caused by members of Evolus. As for those people, it's still unclear whether all of them have been completely eliminated. Have you seen any suspicious adventurers pass through here? I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 210, Chapter 210, Could it be that I'm really an elf succubus? 1210 words. Honestly, I think you're the suspicious one here. Still, Ron didn't say that out loud. Looking at the black-haired girl standing before him, the one with the cold expression and beauty so unreal it felt like something out of a fairy realm, those long, slender elf ears already made her identity obvious. She looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he had seen her before. Still, since she didn't seem openly hostile, and had even helped wipe out those everless cockroaches, Ron chose to remain respectful toward the kind-hearted adventurer. Ron lightly shook his head. "No. This is our familiar's temporary camp. We haven't seen any suspicious adventurers come by." "Understood." The atmosphere suddenly turned awkward. Mainly because Phylvis herself wasn't good at building relationships. Her crimson eyes landed on the handsome young man standing not far away. She tried to convey her thoughts through her gaze alone. But all the elf girl saw in Ron's eyes was deep wariness. So, she decided to break the silence. "I'm an adventurer from the Dionyse familiar, Phylvis. You've heard my name before, right? If I remember correctly, you're Ron from the Hestia familiar. The super rookie known as the Tarnished, the one said to possess talent comparable to a creature." Afraid Ron might not understand the implication, Phylvis deliberately emphasized the word creature, trying to catch even the slightest flaw in the handsome boy's expression. As it turned out, that simple, direct probing was effective. In that brief instant, the black-haired elf girl caught the subtle change in Ron's eyes. Case close. This guy really was her fellow creature. Case close. No wonder the name Phylvis had sounded so familiar. So it was the beautiful elf girl from the Sword Oratoria side story. Her true identity was a creature with strength at LV.7. Toward Phylvis, Ron's feelings were fairly complicated. She was just a pawn manipulated by the god Dionyse. If one really had to say she did something wrong, then maybe it was joining that rescue operation 6 years ago. Damn it. The one spying on me on floor 17 couldn't have been her, right? Only someone with an overwhelming gap in strength could evade his perception entirely. And the Everless attack in Rivera had clearly been real. As for why she had approached him, her probing attitude was obvious. Could it be that after seeing his practically unkillable talent during the battle against the floor boss fire giant, she had mistaken him for a fellow creature? At that thought, Ron's eyes flickered faintly. Phylvis wasn't a bad person. Otherwise, she never would have formed such a deep bond with Lefia. Still, standing face to face with a LV.7 creature in the flesh, it was impossible not to feel nervous. Faced with the black-haired elf girl's questioning, he didn't evade the topic at all. Instead, he subtly answered, "When it comes to talent, I really can't compare to a senior like you. Even now, I'm still just a LV.3 adventurer." He was stalling for time. At the very least, once the Hiryute sisters from the Loki familiar returned, this crisis could temporarily be resolved. Though there was also an extremely slim possibility that Phylvis had approached him with genuine goodwill. Yeah, right. The moment that thought appeared in his head, Ron immediately rejected it. Though admittedly, he really did seem to have unusually good luck with elf girls. But it hadn't reached the level of an elf succubus, right? And from an outsider's perspective, this conversation with no clear beginning or end looked completely like Ron and the adventurer named Phylvis speaking in riddles. Mikoto and Cassandra exchanged glances. The tension in their hearts finally eased considerably. Faced with Ron's openness, Phylvis was instead caught off guard. Being extremely sensitive about her identity as a creature, she immediately picked up on the hidden meaning behind the boy's words. This guy, it seemed the ability he possessed allowed him to see through her true strength. The elf girl lightly shook her head, her tone filled with genuine emotion as she sighed. "Ron, I believe it won't be long before you surpass me. I'm looking forward to it." More accurately, Phylvis was truly happy. It felt as though, in the vast sea that was Ororio, she had finally found another lonely boat capable of understanding and relying on each other. The corners of the girl's cold, untouchable face even curled into a rare smile. Thinking that, as a senior, she really should offer some simple support to a fellow creature, she said, "I'm very glad I met you in the dungeon. If you ever run into trouble you can't solve, come find me." 6 years ago, Phylvis had failed to protect her familiar companions. Faced with the attacks of the corrupted spirit, every member of her familiar had been wiped out in the lower floors. And now, after inheriting all the memories of this body and walking through Rio under the identity of a creature, she had finally found a companion whose identity resonated with her own. No matter what, the girl had already made up her mind. She would protect the handsome boy standing before her. As for the god Dionysus, who assigned her all kinds of missions, she knew very well that, in his eyes, she was nothing more than a tool for carrying out tasks. Only true companions could huddle together for warmth. No matter what kind of trouble it is. I'll find a way to help you solve it. Noticing the two Loki familiar adventurers rapidly approaching from afar, Fylvis frowned slightly, irritation flashing across her face at being interrupted. There were many things she wanted to ask Ron about. But clearly, now was not the right time. The girl wasn't worried about Tiona and the others seeing through her disguise. Right now, what she needed to do was track down those remaining Everless survivors. If she wanted to protect the companion she had finally found with such difficulty, then Fylvis intended to eliminate every Everless member who knew about Ron within the dungeon itself, preventing any information from reaching the gods. This was also the greatest form of protection she could think of for Ron. With the creature talent Ron possessed, surpassing her was only a matter of time. Which meant that before his identity was exposed, she had to hold up a protective umbrella for him. Watching the black-haired elf girl's departing figure, Ron honestly still felt completely dazed. This was a development he had never expected before. Fylvis was no longer merely showing goodwill, this was outright trying to get close to him. The weight contained within the emotions Fylvis had proactively offered couldn't truly be described with words. It was a sense of belonging born from recognizing someone as a companion. Did I somehow become an elf succubus in the dungeon? Most likely, it was his ambiguous answers that had completely convinced Fylvis, who had already suspected his creature identity, to make her final judgment. Damn. But from another angle, the concept of death has already been separated from me, so barely counting as a creature doesn't really seem that unreasonable. Ron suddenly felt like he was frantically testing the boundaries of death itself. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 211, Chapter 211, Tiona's Worries, and the True Purpose of the Godslayer's Greatsword. 1,308 words. What exactly happened here? The disturbance caused by the chain explosions was simply too massive for Rivera. Even the target had been directly aimed at the area where Hestia Familiar was stationed. Especially after being warned by her sister, Tiona immediately rushed back without hesitation. Along the way, she saw the aftermath of the incident that had occurred in Rivera. Fortunately, there had not been any especially serious casualties, the dead were all members of Everless. However, that was only what she had heard from the adventurers on the street. After spending this period exploring the dungeon together, setting aside the bonds that had gradually formed between herself and Ron, the girl clearly understood that those remnants of Everless had most likely learned about the special nature he possessed. The dungeon abnormality incident. They wanted to use the talent Ron possessed to stir up something major inside the dungeon, but judging from the result, their plan had ultimately failed. Looking at the temporary camp, completely intact and showing no traces of battle whatsoever. And then at the boy standing there, gazing into the distance with an extremely complicated expression, Tiona found herself unsure how to begin, ultimately choosing to ask out of concern, "Are you alright? Did another adventurer pass by here just now?" Yeah. Honestly, with Tiona and her sister arriving, at the very least there was no longer any particular need to worry about safety in the current chaos engulfing Rivera. However, that was under the premise that Fylvis held no ill intent toward him. Otherwise, in her fully released state, with the strength of a level 7 creature, she alone could exterminate every adventurer in Rivera. Ron withdrew his gaze from the direction the black-haired elf girl had left in, his emotions carrying an indescribable complexity. The goodwill she had shown was obvious. And that attitude of hers was likewise proof that she was not the mastermind behind this disturbance. As for how exactly he should deal with this, at the moment, he still had no concrete thoughts. Most likely, because of the special nature of the revival skill, that girl had treated him as a fellow creature. In this situation, there was no need to tell the members of Loki Familiar for the time being. Ron lightly shook his head. The situation is complicated. Basically, members of Evolus caused a suicide attack incident in Rivera, and an adventurer who happened to pass by just now came over to ask about the situation. So that's what happened. Tiona finally let out a complete sigh of relief. From the opposite end of the street, she had practically rushed over at full speed, ignoring all the chaos along the way. From beginning to end, her only target had been Ron in the distance. Fortunately, she had arrived at the temporary expedition camp before anything happened to him. As for whether Ron had some deeper cooperation with Captain Finn and Riveria of her familiar in other areas, the girl did not think too deeply about it. Tiona felt that her own thoughts were actually very simple. When facing the fire giant floor boss, Ron had still stepped forward into the sea of the fell god's flames, standing in front of her and helping her escape from danger. Therefore, Ron was someone she absolutely had to protect, no matter what. As for whether those feelings also contained some other emotions mixed within them, even Tiona herself could not figure it out. She simply gazed at the boy in the distance, the one carrying that complicated expression on his face. If there's anything you can't handle. She actually wanted to say that he could come to her for help. But after remembering that Ron already possessed strength comparable to a level 4 adventurer, the girl ultimately gave up on the idea. She raised her head again. If my sister and I can't help you, then we'll go ask Captain Finn and Vice Captain Riveria. They'd definitely be willing to help. Tyon, do I have to go too? Compared to the Evolus attack that had clearly been planned in advance, the far more composed Tyon was more concerned about the implications behind the incident. So, how exactly had those cockroaches lurking in Arario's sores obtained such critical information? However, the moment the girl thought that, she could not help recalling the dungeon abnormality incident and how the monsters and terrain changes it caused had already been discovered by Evolus. Which honestly did not seem that difficult after all. Thanks. It should be fine. Getting accidentally dragged into the artificial labyrinth incident during a dungeon expedition, and then somehow being identified as a companion by a beautiful black-haired elf girl, what exactly was going on here? Feeling Tiona's concern, Ron smiled and nodded without directly refusing. After organizing the information he currently possessed, the person pulling the strings behind everything was actually not difficult to identify. Filvis. After being transformed into a creature, she had been brainwashed by the god Dionysus and became the key executor behind the chaos plan meant to destroy Arario. According to the original storyline, the one who was truly supposed to form a bond with Filvis was Lefia, the golden yellow-haired elf who loved going F8. So this did not really count as stealing her role. Filvis had remained in a repressed state for a long time and was constantly tormented by her clone magic. Given that, Ron could understand why the black-haired elf girl's mental state was so unstable. Still, in terms of appearance alone, she absolutely qualified as an elf beauty. So it looks like I can't stay uninvolved in this mess after all? The gods backing Evolus already knew about the special nature of his despicable outsider ability, but Dionysus definitely would not expose that information publicly. Just the increasing difficulty of the dungeon alone. Most likely, Freya, the goddess leading Arario's strongest familiar, would never simply sit back and let him do whatever he wanted. At this stage, he was still only maintaining a shallow cooperative relationship with Loki familiar. Ever since arriving in Arario, Ron's goals had actually been very simple. Steadily grow stronger through the increased difficulty brought by the Souls-like dungeon and ensure he possessed enough power to face the future Black Dragon crisis. But reality rarely followed expectations. The uniqueness he possessed was not something that absolutely could not be exposed. At the very least, before that happened, he needed enough strength to protect himself within Arario. And right now, it still was not enough. Against a floor boss, he could kill it through self-destructive tactics. If he pushed himself to the limit and executed everything perfectly, he could probably defeat a level 4 adventurer. But what about a level 5? And during the artificial labyrinth incident, surviving safely would require the strength of a top-tier level 6 adventurer, along with cooperation from Loki familiar. Most importantly, there was not much he alone could change. But if he could use his seemingly cursed level of effectiveness against elves to alter Filvis's allegiance and pull her onto his side, then many of these problems would resolve themselves. Sitting on the grass and leaning against the tree trunk behind him, Ron's thoughts drifted far away, until his gaze landed on the weapon left behind by the Ash Judge. The Godslayer's great sword. A weapon meant for slaying gods. Ron truly had never considered using it that way before. After all, the gods of Orario would merely be forcibly returned to heaven if they suffered catastrophic injuries. Even if they died, they would eventually revive again someday in the future. So this anti-god weapon might finally have a chance to serve its real purpose. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 212, Chapter 212, Filvis's Expectations. 1,315 words. At the Dionyse familiar residence. After receiving the confirmed intelligence sent back by Filvis Chalia, the god who usually maintained an elegant demeanor at all times now had his face completely swallowed by a rare gloom. Once again, he had obtained information regarding Ron. That was, the special nature he possessed truly could trigger abnormal incidents within the dungeon, causing never-before-seen monsters and floor bosses to appear. About this, Dionyse was very pleased. At the very least, as long as chaos could continue to spread throughout Orario's dungeon, what he enjoyed the most was precisely the sight of those adventurers looking like powerless insects drowning in despair. However, things never unfolded in the smooth direction he hoped for. It seemed that because Ron's special nature had been exposed, that annoying woman from the Loki familiar had already gotten ahead of him. Which meant, if he tried making contact with Ron on his own, the possibility of exposing himself would become much higher. As for Adler and the others, they already fulfilled all of their obligations. As for the arrangements that follow, I'll have someone else assist you with them. He did not vent his anger toward Filvis, mainly because her mission had already been completed successfully. Using the identity of an adventurer from the Dionyse familiar, she had left Ron with a simple impression that they were adventurers standing against Evolus. This could also be considered the few meager gains bought by Adler and the others' deaths. Continue monitoring them. When there are further arrangements, I'll have you carry them out. Dionyse showed absolutely no suspicion toward the loyalty of the black-haired elf girl before him. As a creature, the driving force that allowed Filvis to keep living was the sense of recognition tied to her identity after the successful execution of the Chaos Plan. Only by continuing to follow his footsteps could she find meaning in life. From this point onward, he definitely could not act rashly anymore. Just as Ron had guessed, the person who least wanted the information about triggering abnormal dungeon incidents to become public was none other than Dionyse himself. Just dealing with the Loki familiar was already enough to give him a headache. If the familiar led by the goddess of beauty Freya also joined the scramble over Ron, then every preparation he had made would become meaningless. Looking at the now hideous-faced Dionyse before her, the black-haired elf girl only felt a sense of unfamiliarity. While carrying out mission after mission in the past, Filvis had already vaguely realized that to this god before her, the one who defined the future, she was probably nothing more than a convenient chess piece with no thoughts of her own. But chess pieces would eventually be discarded. Was the plan of allowing the corrupted spirit to rule the surface, turning all adventurers into creatures like herself, really the goal she wished to pursue? At the very least, not anymore. After coming into contact with another creature who could still get along harmoniously with the adventurers around him and form bonds with them, the girl's heart had already begun to waver. If possible, no one would willingly remain in the darkness. They would rather stand beneath the sunlight outside, breathe fresh air, and enjoy the warm atmosphere brought by friends and companions around them. Then I'll continue the surveillance. Faced with Dionyse's arrangements, Filvis did not refuse. That might arouse his suspicion. What she needed to do was simply obey. It was just. How exactly she chose to obey would depend entirely on her mood. The girl understood clearly. If Ron were dragged into the Chaos Plan, then the companion she had finally managed to find would be placed in extreme danger. What she could do was buy as much time for him as possible. Hurry. Hurry and grow stronger already. This time. The black-haired elf girl placed the hope within her heart onto Ron, a rookie adventurer who was also a creature, yet still managed to be accepted within Orario. Looking at the sunset nearing dusk beyond the familiar residence. Even though the warmth cast upon her body by the setting sun was extremely faint, it still allowed Filvis to recover a slight sense of what it meant to truly be alive. Watching Orario gradually become lively. In the past, she had only felt completely out of place there. But now, she probably needed to start thinking about learning from Ron about how to slowly blend into it all. Even the girl herself failed to realize that whenever she mentioned her companion Ron, the slight curve at the corners of her lips and that faint smile were gradually washing away the cold sense of distance in her beautiful face. Grow until, once you're truly capable of standing on your own, we should finally be able to meet openly, right? What Ron possessed. Filvis truly envied it. Those companions who trusted him completely, those bonds that would immediately reach out a hand whenever danger appeared. However, she also understood that the first thing she needed to control was the worsening mental state caused by the side effects of her clone magic. There's plenty of time. We only used 2 days to successfully reach the safe floor on the 18th floor. Even if we slow down our pace for the remaining 6 floors of the dungeon, we'll still be able to complete the expedition objective within the scheduled time frame. The unrest that had broken out in Rivera had caused already overpriced supplies to rise several more times above their original prices. There was absolutely no way they could resupply here. After briefly laying out the exploration plan for what came next, and after resting throughout the day, Ron could feel his mental state gradually returning to peak condition. As for his encounter with Filvis, he had not explained it to anyone else. In fact, he had a strong premonition that they would definitely meet again somewhere in the upcoming dungeon floors. As for how to pull her over to his side, compared to Ryu and Lefia, Filvis was absolutely the easiest to win over. What she wanted was recognition from companions who were also creatures, a way to confirm the reason she should continue living. So, what he should do was respond to her wishes and gradually help her adapt to the life of an adventurer. Reaching that level alone would already be more than enough. There was no need for her to oppose Dionyse. She only needed to remain neutral. This was not exploitation. Dionyse's plan was destined to fail from the very beginning, and Ron's actions would simply ensure that Bastard lost even more thoroughly. After all, even the target had already been locked onto himself. He glanced around at the adventurers of the expedition party present and spoke in a relaxed tone, As long as we don't try heading into the lower floors, we won't run into mutated floor bosses. Once we return to Orario, the expedition mission will count as complete. No problem. There were no longer any voices of doubt. After experiencing countless mutated monsters and powerful floor bosses, they had long since become fully desensitized to Ron's underworld-style Souls-like dungeon exploration routine. Setting Ron aside, there was no adventurer in Orario more knowledgeable about Souls-like experiences than them. Just as this temporary meeting was about to end, Mikoto, who had already investigated the location of the hot springs beforehand, finally could not hold herself back any longer and excitedly made a suggestion. Then, should we head to the hot springs on the 15th floor next? After these past 2 days of high-intensity combat, only soaking in a hot spring can relieve the fatigue in our muscles. I've got no objections. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 213, Chapter 213, Hot Springs Episode An Encounter with the Black. 1,278 words. As the floor boss, the flame giant, died, the abnormal situation disappeared even after Ron returned to the unexplored regions of floors 15 and 16. The minotaurs they encountered along the way had already reverted to their original state. Weak, ordinary monsters from the middle floors were roughly equivalent to LV.2 adventurers in raw combat strength, and for an expedition team tempered through Souls-like trials. They were basically stray dogs at the roadside, casually kicked to death. Especially after the suicide attack incident in Rivera, along with his brief contact with Filvis, The sense of being watched that had been lingering around Ron finally disappeared. Following Mikoto's lead, the expedition party quickly returned to floor 15. After passing through a winding cavern passageway and entering a crack that extended from the end of a tunnel, they arrived at the final destination of this trip. Looking at the natural hot spring before him, steam constantly rising into the air along with a faint sulfuric scent, Ron considered his expression management fairly decent. He truly hadn't expected that in this Western fantasy-style world, he would actually get to enjoy a natural hot spring, something he had never personally experienced even in his previous life. His gaze swept across the girls nearby. Hot springs were great. Mainly because these past 2 days of continuous dungeon exploration had been absurdly intense. Simple rest alone definitely wasn't enough to relieve the exhaustion weighing on both body and mind. As for the exploration ahead, Ron honestly didn't even dare imagine it. At minimum, the monster's baseline strength would probably already be at the peak LV.3 level, and there would likely be even stronger ones capable of rivaling LV.4 adventurers. It was both good news and bad news. At the very least, his status values could improve rapidly. Once this familiar expedition ended, even if he didn't directly advance to LV.4, he was probably not far from completely breaking past the theoretical limit of his abilities. Without noticing that Ron was walking at the back of the group, Mikoto, who had already investigated the area, swept her gaze across the beautiful girls participating in this expedition. There are 2 hot springs in total. As for Commander Ron, it's a little inconvenient no matter how you look at it, since you're the only man here. Her eyes landed on Ron. To be honest, Mikoto's feelings toward Ron were somewhat complicated. Even her reason for joining the Hestia Familia had always been very clear from the start: rapidly improve herself. As for romantic feelings and matters like that, she had never considered them at all. Especially considering Hestia's attitude toward Ron back at the Familiar residence, her affection was basically visible to the naked eye. Since she was receiving the goddess's favor and care, then at times like this, she had to do something. So, Commander Ron, you can stay here. Daphne and the others and I will head to the hot spring nearby. If anything happens, we can still provide support immediately. The other members present had no objections to the arrangement. Perhaps if it were a one-on-one situation, they wouldn't have been so awkward about it. But in front of adventurers from both the Hestia Familia and Loki Familia, they still couldn't quite go that far. Even Tiona was no exception. She herself didn't fully understand what that unique emotion she felt toward Ron actually was. For now, she could only regard it as an extension of the gratitude she felt toward her savior. Many adventurers believed Amazonas girls were especially open-minded. But in reality, that wasn't the case. It was simply because the Familia led by the beauty goddess Ishtar in Orario had damaged the reputation of the Amazonas race there. We'll meet up later, Ron. Only Ron was left standing there, watching the beautiful girls departing backs as he fell into brief contemplation. Why was this development a little different from what he had imagined? Damn. What happened to the promised hot spring fanservice episode? Why'd it disappear when it got to me? During a dungeon expedition, unless one reached the lower floors where basic hygiene was manageable, proper cleaning was completely impossible in the middle floors. There simply weren't any conditions for it. More importantly, from the perspective of a modern person, Ron genuinely couldn't tolerate going nearly 10 days without bathing. Even if there wasn't going to be a hot spring fanservice episode with beautiful girls accompanying him, a hot spring was still a hot spring. He was absolutely going to soak in it. However, before Ron could even enjoy the muscle-relaxing comfort brought by the spring's pleasant temperature, he noticed faint footsteps approaching from ahead. He abruptly raised his head. The person who entered his sight was not one of the expedition party's girls, yet it was still the face of an elf beauty he could never possibly forget. Filvis. Ron honestly wasn't surprised that she had come looking for him. And considering the goodwill she had shown earlier, the atmosphere wasn't particularly tense either. Does a beautiful monster girl still count as a beautiful girl? What are you talking about? After reporting vague information back to the god Dionyse, Filvis had not remained in Orario. Instead, she used the artificial labyrinth to quickly reach the deep floors. Soon, She found the companion she was looking for. Originally, she had still been worrying about how to create an opportunity to speak with Ron alone. But Mikoto's suggestion had just so happened to give her the perfect chance to approach him. Still, when the black-haired elf girl looked at the steaming hot spring before her, along with Ron who had most of his body submerged in it, confusion appeared in her eyes. Within the memories she had inherited from this body called Filvis, there was no explanation related to this sort of thing. Could it be that Ron had some personal reasoning behind doing this? Filvis cautiously asked, "What exactly are you doing?" "Nothing much. Want to try soaking in the hot spring? It can help relieve mental stress." Since she had specifically come to the dungeon to look for him, Filvis naturally had her own reasons. And even if she didn't, Ron had no objections to building a decent relationship with her. Even though she wandered Orario under the identity of a creature, the things Filvis had done were far more decent than most adventurers. Thus, the elf succubus decided to guide this lost girl toward the future. Okay. Filvis had already reduced the frequency with which she used her Einsail magic. At the very least, the memory confusion symptoms had gradually improved over the past 2 days, and her mental state was steadily recovering. Faced with Ron's suggestion, the black-haired girl hesitated for a moment before lightly nodding in agreement. However, she did not completely imitate Ron. After inheriting Filvis's memories, she at least possessed a clear understanding regarding the distinction between men and women. As she soaked in the steaming hot spring water, perhaps because she had finally found a sense of belonging with a fellow creature, the tension in Filvis's mind eased somewhat, and even her tightly furrowed brows gradually relaxed. Of course, she had not forgotten the main purpose behind seeking out Ron this time. Dionyse is still arranging for me to approach you. His goal is to use the uniqueness of your talent to create chaos among Orario's adventurers. His original plan was to have the corrupted spirit turn you into a creature. But I'll buy you time. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 214, Chapter 214, The Plan to Save Filvis, A Tangled Situation. 1,253 words. Even though he had anticipated it, Ron never expected that the goodwill released by Filvis would end up providing such critical information directly. Buying time. That was exactly what he needed right now. Only by growing strong enough could he face the conspiracies that would inevitably unfold around the secrets he carried. Knowing Dionyse's nature, if Filvis failed to achieve the outcome he wanted, he would absolutely send other creatures or members of Evolus to probe further and begin taking concrete action. Sometimes, having absurdly good talent was a headache in itself. If Dionyse ever realized that behind the fog gate lurked the pus of man capable of destroying Orario, the consequences would be unimaginable. Even while soaking in the hot spring, Ron could still feel a trace of coldness. This wasn't something caution alone could prevent. The dungeon transformation effects brought by the despicable outsider could never be perfectly concealed. The reward brought by such high risks was the rapid growth of an adventurer's strength. But the hidden dangers accompanying it had already become extremely troublesome. The coveting gaze of the Evolus gods. And even the uniqueness he possessed had already become an indispensable part of the god Dionysus' madness plan. Action against him was inevitable. How come? It feels like I need to seize enough initiative in this whole mess. As if noticing the grave expression on Ron's face, Filvis's originally cold and stunning fairy-like face, with black hair and crimson eyes, rarely showed a trace of emotional movement. As fellow creatures, this was a matter of stance. Clearly, the path the boy before her had chosen was to live as a normal adventurer and truly become part of that world. She couldn't provide an answer. But destroying Orario and allowing the corrupted spirit to rule the surface was not a future the girl wished to see. If that happened, it would only give rise to new conflicts and friction. In other words, Ron had already become the version of herself she wished she could have been. Thinking of that, the girl slowly rose from the hot spring pool. Her familiar uniform, soaked through by the water, clung tightly to her originally form-fitting outfit, perfectly tracing Filvis's already beautiful figure. The droplets hanging from the tips of her hair paired flawlessly with her cold, elegant elven face. Pure allure was nothing less than this. Perhaps sensing Ron's inner conflict, the girl walked over to him. Bending slightly, she reached out her hand and imitated the way humans comforted one another, gently patting his head. Adventurers comfort people like this, right? Why were creatures all this absurdly Yasashi? Ron raised his head and looked directly into the crimson eyes of the black-haired elf girl. Compared to before, there was now a faint spark of life gradually returning to them. His mood felt strangely complicated. After all, the way this connection between them had begun was honestly pretty weird. That's right. Inheriting Filvis's memories from before her death did not mean the black-haired girl before him was a mentally complete person. She was more like a blank sheet of paper. It was just that, under Dionysa's brainwashing, that blank sheet had been turned into a blueprint for destroying Orario. About the artificial labyrinth. Can you tell me everything you know? Ron felt like freeloading off Filvis's goodwill wasn't exactly right. At the same time, this was also a way of guiding the elf girl in another direction. So when he asked the question, he decisively offered his help as well. I'm not going to make you help for nothing. I'll also teach you how to blend in, how to become an adventurer and adapt to living normally in Orario in the future. Okay. The artificial labyrinth is actually connected to the god of death, Thanatos. Barca, the descendants of Daedalus, worked together with members of the Thanatos Familia to build it. As for the funding, it was provided by Orario's Ishtar Familia. Filvis did not refuse Ron's request. After confirming each other's identities as creatures, she truly could no longer follow Dionysa's wishes and harm one of her own kind. At that point, the girl's expression became rarely serious. So you need time. Dionysa works very closely with the corrupted spirit. They even control Gugalana, the power bull demi-spirit. A demi-spirit whose strength rivals a LV.7 adventurer. As for the things you mentioned, Filvis was indeed very interested, but she understood the priorities of the situation. After thinking seriously for a moment, she tilted her head slightly. Then tell me after this whole storm is over. Watching the graceful back of the black-haired elf girl as she left, Ron slowly closed his eyes and began recalling things. The side story portions of DanMachi. He couldn't remember every detail. He only retained clearer impressions of the key targets. And now, because of his own appearance, the plot had already spiraled completely out of control. It had developed to a point where it could no longer be contained. If he wanted to raise his strength to the level necessary for self-preservation before this ticking bomb fully exploded, he honestly had little confidence. At minimum, he would need to reach LV.5. But that was absolutely unrealistic. The Ishtar Familia. The rabbit arrived in Orario ahead of schedule. Which means the Killing Stone plan is still only in preparation, and the fox girl Haruheim is probably still imprisoned. With Yukaide no Kozuchi, it can temporarily raise an adventurer's level. By the time his thoughts reached this point, Ron already had a rough direction in mind. As a member of the Ishtar Familia, the uniqueness of Sanjuno Haruheim's magic went without saying. It was absolutely bug level. Yukaide no Kozuchi. 9-fold. At most, the magic of Yukaide no Kozuchi could be granted to 9 adventurers. If they could recruit the fox girl Haruheim into the Hestia Familia, she would absolutely become one of the highest-tier support members during future Souls-like dungeon expeditions. If there's a chance, should I just rescue Haruheim directly? The strongest combat force within the Ishtar Familia was none other than the battle prostitute Phryne, a LV.5 adventurer whose alias was Men Killer. As for the other members, they also possessed several LV.4 adventurers. In terms of familiar ranking within the guild, they far surpassed the current Hestia Familia. Worthy of the title, the strongest A-rank familiar outside of the Loki and Freya familiars. What a pain. If he wanted to eliminate the hidden danger posed by Dionysa, he needed enough strength to face the coming threats. But achieving multiple breakthroughs in a short period of time was simply unrealistic. Still, if he truly had the freedom to choose his opponent, Ron would rather choose the latter, the Ishtar Familia. Not only could he obtain the bug-level support of Sanjuno Haruheim, he could also cooperate with the Loki Familia. Maybe, he could completely seize the initiative against the schemes of the god Dionysus. Otherwise, powerful creatures would continue coveting him from the shadows. Even exploring the dungeon made Ron feel uncomfortable all over. He constantly had to stay on guard, afraid of being abducted by creatures and falling into the hands of Dionysus and the corrupted spirit. The consequences would absolutely be unimaginable. My entire life has been like walking on thin ice. So in this goddamned storm of chaos, can I actually make it to the other side? I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/Tito Villa. Chapter 215, Chapter 215, A Familiar of Monsters. 1,254 words. The suicide attack carried out by Evelus on Rivera Street did not affect Ron, Tiona, and the others as they rested on the safe floor. More accurately, no adventurer would ever associate something like that with the Loki familiar. That golden reputation alone saved them a great deal of trouble. After soaking in the hot springs and resting through the entire night, the physical exhaustion brought on by 2 consecutive days of high-intensity combat had completely disappeared. Ron looked at the area before him, a place that resembled a paradise isolated from the world. He knew very well. Their brief period of leisure was about to end. Morning. Captain Ron, breakfast is ready. Mikoto, who had already unlocked her housewife attributes, had gotten up early to prepare a simple meal. At the very least, it tasted far better than dry rations. The girl raised her head. At least in terms of energy and spirit, she looked visibly refreshed. Once we fill our stomachs, we can start thinking about setting out. Their destination was the 24th floor. Before reaching the end of the middle floors, there would be no more safe floors where they could rest. Just thinking about the absurd difficulty of the monsters down there. Honestly, even with her current LV.3 strength, Mikoto still found it extremely taxing. But correspondingly, it would also allow her abilities to improve in a much more comprehensive way. This was exactly the result she wanted after joining the Hestia Familiar. Yeah. We'll stick to the same approach as before. Clear out all the special monsters on each floor first, then consider advancing deeper. As for splitting up, Ron absolutely, positively would not consider doing that during this familiar expedition. If they ran into another mutated floor boss blocking the path again, things probably wouldn't end nearly as easily. After quickly finishing breakfast, he looked toward the beautiful girls who had only just woken up and were currently washing up, then chose to check his revival skill. Revival 1. Even while inside the dungeon, the number of revivals still refreshed once the second day arrived. As for the remaining 2 chances, they could be replenished by consuming soul shards. This was Ron's greatest reliance while exploring. The unfortunate part was that the appearance timing of mutated floor bosses could not be controlled, and there was no precise way to track time inside the dungeon either. Otherwise, things would have been much simpler. What a shame. This talent can only be used inside the dungeon. If he could bring that talent into Orario, then the moment he reached LV.4, Ron was confident he could march straight into the Ishtar Familiar and directly kidnap Haraheim out of there. Just as he was making preparations, the other members of the Familiar, Daphne, Expedition Supporter Tiona, and the rest displayed extremely high adventurer professionalism, without any unnecessary dawdling. Very quickly, they had already finished preparing for the deeper exploration. Having long since grown accustomed to the dungeon abnormal situations that seemed to follow Ron everywhere, Tiona's eyes were filled with anticipation toward today's dungeon, which was once again full of unknown dangers. Are we leaving already? Ron did not answer. His gaze briefly swept across the faces of the beautiful girls before finally locking onto the gloomy girl standing habitually behind her best friend Daphne at the very back. Cassandra. 5-dimension Troya. From a transmigrator's perspective, he was completely immune to the effects brought about by magic. Which meant that her prophetic dreams were effectively warning bells for what awaited them on this journey. Landsoaks. The fire giant. Neither of those 2 floor boss raids had gone particularly smoothly. If possible, Ron genuinely hoped that the upcoming exploration could proceed safely and without incident. It should. Faced with Ron's gaze, Cassandra instinctively lowered her head. Her pale cheeks, half hidden beneath her long blue hair, reflected her naturally timid personality. After their previous 2 conversations, she actually understood very clearly. Ron was asking about her prophetic dreams, and whether they would encounter any special danger during the upcoming dungeon exploration. To be trusted. To even become someone whose words were acknowledged and affirmed, naturally made Cassandra very happy. But, when the girl recalled what had happened last night, a faint blush immediately spread across her fair cheeks. There was no way she could directly tell Captain Ron that because he was there, she had felt so safe that she simply fell asleep, right? There probably won't be any problems. Hope flickered within Cassandra's eyes. After experiencing these Souls-like style dungeons, she had naturally grown somewhat in terms of personality, no longer hiding behind others all the time. Summoning her courage, she stood beside her best friend Daphne. Last night, I didn't dream about anything bad related to the upcoming exploration. Even if there really are unknown dangers, I believe everyone will definitely make it through safely. This was absolutely the best news possible. Without the hidden danger of another mutated floor boss, then all they needed to face were the special monsters altered by Souls-like corruption. There was basically no need to worry about safety issues. Ron finally let out a sigh of relief. Because, given the kind of bullshit this godforsaken dungeon loved to pull, if it suddenly started dragging out floor bosses straight from Elden Ring or Dark Souls and then buffed all of their stats across the board, he didn't even dare imagine how horrifying the price of clearing them would become. Then, let's move out. Walking at the very front of the expedition party was the group led by Ron, the members of the Hestia Familia. Ironically, supporters from the Loki Familia were following behind them instead. Their adventurer levels alone already spoke for themselves. And after personally experiencing the rescue operation carried out by Ron and her younger sister Tiona, Tyon's mood became unusually heavy whenever the topic of prophetic dreams came up again. Under normal circumstances, she definitely would have dismissed it as nonsense, nothing more than psychological stress messing with someone's head. But according to Cassandra's description from yesterday, the fire giant, the sea of flames that swallowed all of them whole, every single thing had actually happened on the 17th floor. So why was everyone else acting like they didn't care at all? Even she herself had only remembered those clues she ignored yesterday because of Ron's questioning. Yeah. The Amazoness girl tugged awkwardly at the corner of her lips. Seriously, how did this suddenly appearing Hestia Familia end up looking like it's full of hidden monsters and geniuses? Futsuno Mitema. The gravity magic capable of controlling mutated floor bosses. That gloomy girl with prophetic dreams that acted like warning signals. Commander Daphne, whose magic could temporarily increase defense and durability resistance, and so on. Especially Ron, the captain of the Hestia Familia. Whether it was his dungeon hatred, his revival from near death, or all sorts of overwhelmingly destructive magic. That guy was a complete monster through and through. I seriously can't figure it out. But Tyon knew that once this Familia expedition ended, it probably wouldn't even take very long before the Hestia Familia, under Ron's leadership, would very quickly become one of the top factions in Orario. At the same time, the girl was also looking forward to what kind of future awaited them once the Loki Familia and the Hestia Familia truly entered into full cooperation. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Chapter 216, Chapter 216, Loki, why do I feel like I'm about to die? 1,363 words. According to the descriptions given by the Adventurers Guild, once one left the safe floor known as the Labyrinth Paradise on the 18th floor, the dungeon environment beyond that point would undergo earth-shaking changes. No longer cave tunnels. Instead, the dungeon would take the form of a forest. This special terrain continued up until the 24th floor, earning it the title of the Great Tree Labyrinth. The environment was absolutely dreadful. Abnormal status effects, especially poison attribute monsters and traps, would increase drastically. There were even mushroom monsters constantly spreading poisonous spores everywhere. Of course, that level of difficulty only applied to normal adventurers. Before actually arriving there, Ron himself had no idea, after being strengthened by the Souls-like system, just how difficult the road ahead had become overall. Troublesome. The path ahead was uncertain. But a real man couldn't say he couldn't do it. Ron had even considered whether he should simply stop participating in the upcoming exploration and let the dungeon return to normal. However, that ticking bomb from the god Dionysus, capable of exploding at any moment, was like an infantry fighting vehicle relentlessly closing in behind him. There was no room to retreat. Hopefully, after this familiar expedition ends, I can successfully become a level 4 adventurer. Ron stared ahead. The staircase passage leading toward the Great Tree Labyrinth radiated an unprecedented level of malice. The sensation made him feel like a lone boat drifting in the middle of the ocean. The same familiar feeling again. Now this felt right. The headquarters of the Loki Familiar. After the dungeon expedition ended, most of the members welcomed a short vacation period, freely resting around Rio, maintaining weapons, and so on. But for Finn, this vacation wasn't relaxing in the slightest. First, Lefia, the mage being groomed as a core pillar and a potential successor to Reveria, had joined the expedition. Second, the Familiar's 2 top combat forces, the Hiryute sisters, had been assigned protection duties. On the surface, everything looked perfectly arranged, with every aspect thoroughly accounted for, yet the blonde-haired boy constantly felt his thumb throbbing in pain. Why do I keep feeling like something bad is about to happen? Finn couldn't figure it out. Still, there were definitely benefits. At the very least, Tyon wasn't clinging to him all day long anymore, leaving him without even a moment of quiet space. That was something he absolutely couldn't accept. After spending the past 2 days handling the various affairs within the Familiar, the blonde-haired boy finally had time to think about how exactly he should establish cooperation with that Ron from the Hestia Familiar. He really was young. Yet in terms of the way he handled things, the guy was exceptionally seasoned. Moreover, in this cooperation, Ron held complete initiative, leaving Finn with no choice but to compromise. Otherwise, he would miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rise. Hopefully it's just my imagination. There's no reason 2 level 5 adventurers would run into trouble in the middle floors. If that actually happened, I can't even imagine how terrifying the exploration difficulty would be. Finn could only comfort himself like this. And right at that moment, the door to the Familiar captain's office was suddenly pushed open. Just as the blonde-haired boy looked up in surprise, he noticed that familiar face. A royal elf of green-haired lineage. And also his vice-captain within the Loki Familiar, Reveria Ijos Alf. What is it? As cold and distant as an iceberg, with eyes that seemed devoid of any emotional fluctuation, the royal elf placed the wrapped cloth bundle she held in her palm onto the table. As the rope was untied, the next thing presented before Finn's eyes was a tree branch whose bark had already been peeled away, revealing an ash-brown trunk beneath, while continuously radiating the aura of magical power. The branch of the great holy tree. It's here. Yeah. A budget of 50 million wasn't enough at all. The elven chief of the Vysen hidden realm refused to sell it cheaply. We had to add another 30 million ourselves. And even then, that was already the discounted price. As for the selling price of the branch of the great holy tree, Reveria actually thought it was normal. Some adventurers had even offered as much as 150 million valis to buy it. The current price was practically a half-off discount. The key point was the extra 30 million valis had to be paid out of the Loki Familiar's own pocket, serving as the entry ticket before formally beginning cooperation with Ron. So that's how it is. No wonder. Finn had constantly felt his thumb aching. Under normal circumstances, after deducting equipment maintenance, various supplies, and member salaries from a familiar expedition, the final profit would only be around 40 to 50 million valis. And even that money still had to be reserved for future expeditions. But now that things had reached this point, the sunk cost was already there, they couldn't back out anymore. It's fine. If we can establish full cooperation with Ron, I believe the returns will absolutely far exceed this bit of valis in front of us. After all, money couldn't buy the strength of familiar members. I think so too. Reveria didn't refute that. The branch of the great holy tree had already been obtained, and the remaining payment absolutely had to be delivered to the other party. It concerned the overall reputation of the Loki familiar within Aurario. After spending that much money, they naturally needed some way to make up for the familiar's financial losses. That was when she thought of the old equipment that had been left forgotten in storage and could no longer be used. If they sold it all off, it would at least add several million valis back into the familiar's books. However, when Reveria went to inspect the familiar warehouse, she didn't see any of the old equipment at all. At that moment, she had already realized the matter was anything but ordinary. There's one more thing. All the old equipment that used to be in storage has disappeared. Was it reasonable for every stockpiled piece of equipment in the Loki familiar warehouse to vanish? At the very least, she couldn't think of any possibility of theft. The familiar expedition had only ended recently, and there were only 2 keys to the storage vault. One was with her. As for the other, it was kept by Loki. The moment she mentioned that, Finn suddenly raised his head. No words were exchanged, yet the instant their eyes met, they already had a rough idea. The culprit could only be their own, that utterly unreliable, alcohol-loving goddess. The key issue was that this behavior made absolutely no sense. If she simply wanted money for alcohol, there was no need to sell off every single piece of equipment. That would only expose the matter even faster. So, did our goddess participate in that wager between Ron and the Apollo familiar, and then bet everything on Apollo and lose all the money? Following the tiny clues hidden within the details, Finn and Reveria quickly reconstructed the rough outline of what had happened. The branch of the Great Holy Tree was something Ron wanted. Yet the one paying the remaining 50 million valis was Hephaestus. It was hard not to suspect that angle. Silence. Inside the office, the 2 high-ranking members of the familiar who had vaguely guessed the truth looked at one another, their eyes filled with nothing but utter despair and the urge to vent it somewhere. And then, the office door was quietly pushed open. Supporting herself against the wall, cheeks flushed red and faintly drunk, Loki leaned against the nearby door frame. After hearing that the branch of the Great Holy Tree had already arrived, and with the debt repayment looming right before her eyes, the feeling that this ticking bomb was finally about to disappear made her rush over impatiently. Only, when faced with Finn and Reveria's gazes, Loki felt her scalp go numb. If there's nothing else, I won't disturb you guys. I will post some extra chapters in Patreon, you can check it out. patreon.com/TitoVilla. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.